Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. Sheriff Elias Montoya had been serving for 17 years at the Pima County Sheriff's Department, an American law enforcement agency serving areas outside the municipal boundaries of Pima County. In July 2019, in the scorching afternoon heat, a call would test the sheriff's knowledge of the desert. Heading north on Highway 86 toward the western region of Saguaro National Park, the temperature gauge in the patrol car read 118 degrees Fahrenheit. Over the radio, Deputy Sheriff Harrison's voice provided updates on the situation requiring this emergency response. A group of 8 tourists from various East Coast cities had failed to return from what should have been a 6-hour guided hiking tour through the Sonoran Desert. Their guide, a woman named Marisol Vega, who worked for Desert Dreams Adventure Tours, had led them out at dawn when the temperature was still bearable, around 85 degrees. The tour was supposed to follow the well-marked King Canyon Trail, a moderate difficulty path that wound through spectacular saguaro forests and offered stunning views of the Tucson Mountains. By 2 in the afternoon, when the group should have been back at the visitor center enjoying cold drinks and sharing photos, there was no sign of them. The company owner had tried calling Vega's satellite phone multiple times with no response. Her personal cell phone went straight to voicemail. The emergency beacon that all guides were required to carry hadn't been activated. As the afternoon wore on and the desert heat intensified to dangerous levels, the situation had escalated from concerning to potentially life-threatening. Montoya pulled into the dusty parking area at the King Canyon trailhead, where several vehicles were already gathered. 2 park rangers stood near a white van marked with the Desert Dreams logo, the vehicle that should have been carrying 8 exhausted but exhilarated tourists back to their air-conditioned hotels. Instead, it sat empty, its keys still hanging on the hook in the company's office where Vega had left them that morning. The sheriff recognized one of the rangers, Tom Brennan, a weathered man in his 50s who knew these trails better than anyone. Brennan's expression was grim as Montoya approached, his hand shading his eyes against the brutal afternoon sun. The concern etched on his face told Montoya this wasn't going to be a simple case of tourists losing track of time while taking photographs. "Elias," Brennan said by way of greeting, his voice rough from years of desert living. "We've had volunteers checking the main trail for the past 2 hours. No sign of them, not even at the usual spots where groups typically stop for breaks." Montoya felt the heat radiating off the ground in waves that made the distant mountains shimmer like mirages. He pulled out the manifest that dispatch had forwarded to his phone, scanning the list of missing tourists. 8 names, ages ranging from 24 to 67. 4 couples from different cities: Boston, Philadelphia, New York, and Washington, D.C. All had booked this tour weeks in advance, drawn by the company's excellent reviews and Vega's reputation as one of the most knowledgeable guides in southern Arizona. "Tell me about Marisol Vega," Montoya said, though he already knew her by reputation. The desert tourism community was relatively small, and word traveled fast about the good guides and the bad ones. "She's one of the best," Brennan replied without hesitation. 20 years of experience out here. Grew up in Tucson, knows every trail, every water source, every potential hazard. She's brought groups through during monsoon storms and never had so much as a twisted ankle among her clients. This doesn't make sense. Montoya agreed. Experienced guides didn't just vanish with entire tour groups. Either something had gone catastrophically wrong, or there was more to this situation than a simple case of getting lost. He studied the map that Brennan had spread out on the hood of his truck, noting the highlighted route of the King Canyon Trail. It was a loop trail, 6 miles total, with several clearly marked intersections and rest areas. "Has anyone checked the alternate routes?" Montoya asked, tracing his finger along several smaller trails that branched off from the main path. "We've had people at every major intersection," Brennan confirmed. "Nothing. It's like they just vanished into thin air." He paused, then added quietly, "There's something else, Elias. Something strange." Montoya looked up from the map, noting the uncertainty in the ranger's eyes. Brennan was not a man given to dramatics or speculation. If something had unsettled him, it was worth taking seriously. "About 3 miles in, near Wasson Peak Junction, we found some of the trail markers had been moved," Brennan said, his voice dropping as if he was reluctant to voice his concerns aloud. "Someone had repositioned the cairns, the stacked rocks that mark the trail. They now point toward an old mining road that's been officially closed for years. It leads into some rough country, full of abandoned prospects and mine shafts from the 1890s. The implications sent a chill through Montoya despite the oppressive heat. Deliberately moved trail markers suggested intent, planning, possibly even malice. Tourists following false markers could easily become disoriented, especially in the harsh afternoon heat when judgment could become impaired and every ravine started to look the same. "Show me," Montoya said. They took Brennan's Park Service vehicle, specially equipped for the rough terrain, and drove as far as the maintenance road would allow before continuing on foot. Even with the sun beginning its descent toward the western mountains, the heat remained oppressive. Montoya could feel his shirt soaking through with sweat within minutes of leaving the air-conditioned vehicle. He couldn't imagine what it would be like for tourists unaccustomed to this environment, possibly running low on water, certainly beginning to panic. The hike to the altered trail markers took 45 minutes. As they walked, Brennan pointed out the legitimate trail, marked by official signs and well-worn paths. But there, at a crucial junction where hikers needed to turn east to complete the loop back to the parking area, someone had indeed repositioned the cairns. The stacked rocks now formed an arrow pointing north, toward a barely visible path that disappeared into a maze of organ pipe cacti and volcanic rock. Montoya crouched beside the false markers, examining them carefully. The rocks had been recently moved. He could see the depressions in the earth where they had originally stood, the soil still slightly damp in the shadows where the morning dew hadn't completely evaporated. This had been done within the last day, possibly even that very morning. "Why would someone do this?" Brennan asked, though they both knew there were no good answers to that question. The desert had always attracted its share of disturbed individuals, people who came here to lose themselves or to ensure others became lost. Montoya stood, his knees protesting after too many years of desert patrol work, and studied the false trail. It was subtle enough that tired hikers, especially those trusting their guide's expertise, might not question the direction. Vega would have been at the front of the group, possibly engaged in conversation, possibly distracted by questions from her clients. If she had been following what she believed were the correct markers, she might not have realized the deception until it was too late. "We need to follow this path," Montoya said, already dreading what they might find. The old mining area was notorious among local law enforcement. Over the years, it had been the site of numerous accidents, from amateur prospectors falling into unmarked shafts to drug runners using the abandoned tunnels as temporary stash houses. It was no place for a group of tourists, especially as dehydration and heat exhaustion began to take their toll. They returned to the staging area to organize a proper search party. Montoya called in additional deputies and coordinated with the Park Service's emergency response team. As the sun began to set, painting the desert in shades of orange and red that would have been beautiful under different circumstances, 20 searchers set out along the false trail, equipped with powerful flashlights, emergency medical supplies, and enough water to sustain both themselves and any survivors they might find. The path grew increasingly treacherous as they moved away from the established trail system. What had started as a faint track through the desert became a boulder-strewn ravine that required careful navigation. Montoya could see how a group of tourists, already exhausted and disoriented, might have struggled with this terrain. Every few hundred yards, the searchers would stop and call out, their voices echoing off the canyon walls, but only silence answered them. It was Deputy Martinez who spotted the first sign of the missing group, a blue baseball cap caught on a cholla cactus beside the path. According to the manifest, one of the tourists, a dentist from Philadelphia named Robert Hutchinson, had been wearing a Penn State cap. The fabric was still damp with sweat, suggesting it had been lost recently, perhaps within the last few hours. The discovery energized the search party, but it also increased their anxiety. If the group had made it this far into the wilderness, they were now miles from any marked trail, deep in the territory that even experienced hikers avoided. The old mining claims in this area were a labyrinth of dangerous excavations, many of them hidden by decades of erosion and overgrowth. As full darkness fell, the search took on an increasingly desperate quality. The temperature had dropped to a more manageable 95 degrees, but for people who had been exposed to extreme heat all day, potentially without adequate water, hypothermia could become a concern as the desert night grew cooler. Montoya knew they were racing against time. The human body could only endure so much stress before it began to shut down. The radio crackled with a transmission from one of the Park Service teams searching a parallel ravine. "Sheriff, we've found something. A backpack and what looks like blood on the rocks. Grid reference 779. Montoya's heart sank as he consulted his GPS device and began making his way toward the coordinates. The backpack, when he reached it, was expensive, the kind purchased by tourists who wanted the best equipment for their once-in-a-lifetime desert adventure. The blood on the nearby rocks wasn't extensive, perhaps from a fall or a cactus encounter, but it was fresh enough to still be tacky in the dry desert air. Inside the backpack, they found a wallet belonging to James Morrison, the 67-year-old retiree from Boston. His wife Eleanor was also part of the tour group. The pack contained the usual tourist supplies: sunscreen, an expensive camera, energy bars, and 2 empty water bottles. The fact that Morrison had abandoned his pack suggested either extreme disorientation or that something had forced him to leave it behind in haste. "Fan out from here," Montoya ordered his deputies. "Stay in visual contact with at least one other searcher. This terrain is treacherous enough without losing any of our own people." As they spread out across the rocky landscape, their flashlight beams creating shifting patterns of light and shadow, Montoya couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something crucial. The moved trail markers suggested deliberate action, but to what end? If someone had wanted to rob the tourists, there were easier ways. If they had wanted to harm them, why lead them so far into the wilderness? It was nearly midnight when they found the first member of the tour group. David Kramer, a 45-year-old investment banker from New York, was huddled in the shadow of a massive boulder, barely conscious. His skin was hot to the touch, his lips cracked and bleeding. When the paramedics managed to get an IV line started and began pushing fluids, he began to mumble incoherently about the guide, about Vega, about how she had insisted they keep walking even when some of the group wanted to turn back. "She said she knew a shortcut," Kramer managed to whisper, his voice barely audible. "Said she'd done it dozens of times, but then Then she started acting strange, like she was looking for something or someone. Before Montoya could question him further, Kramer's eyes rolled back and he lost consciousness again. The paramedics rushed him toward the evacuation helicopter that had managed to find a landing zone about a mile away. 1 found, 7 to go, but Kramer's words had added a new dimension to the search. What had Vega been looking for? And perhaps more importantly, who might have been waiting for her? The search continued through the night, the desert taking on an otherworldly quality under the stark illumination of searchlights and headlamps. Every shadow could hide a body, every ravine could conceal the missing tourists. The searchers' calls echoed through the canyons, creating an haunting chorus that seemed to emphasize the vastness of the wilderness and the impossibility of their task. As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky in pale blues and pinks, Montoya stood on a ridge overlooking the search area. Somewhere out there were 7 people and their guide, possibly injured, certainly dehydrated, potentially in grave danger. The moved trail markers suggested this wasn't a simple accident, but rather something more sinister. Someone had wanted that tour group to get lost, and they had succeeded all too well. The second day of the search began with temperatures already climbing past 90 degrees before the sun had fully risen above the jagged peaks of the Tucson Mountains. Sheriff Montoya had managed only 2 hours of sleep in his patrol vehicle before the arrival of additional resources forced him back into action. The Arizona Department of Public Safety had sent a specialized search and rescue unit, and the FBI had been notified due to the interstate nature of the case, with victims from multiple states. The search area had been divided into a grid pattern, with teams systematically covering each section. Drones equipped with thermal cameras buzzed overhead, their operators searching for heat signatures that might indicate survivors. But the desert was vast, and the old mining district where the false trail led was a maze of canyons, ridges, and abandoned excavations that could hide 100 people. It was Marisol Vega's employer, Jack Rawlings, who provided the first real break in the case. He arrived at the mobile command post that had been established at the King Canyon trailhead, his face haggard with worry and lack of sleep. In his hands, he carried a tablet computer that he thrust at Montoya without preamble. "I've been going through Marisol's employment records, her recent communications," Rawlings said, his words tumbling out in a rush. "She's been getting strange messages for the past 3 weeks. Emails from someone calling themselves Desert Watcher. They knew things about her routes, her schedule, details that weren't public information." Montoya took the tablet, scrolling through the email chain. The messages started innocuously enough, praising Vega's knowledge of the desert, asking about specific trails and historical sites, but they quickly became more personal, more invasive. The sender knew where Vega lived, what car she drove, even mentioned seeing her at a grocery store in Tucson. The final message, sent just 2 days before the tour group disappeared, was the most disturbing. "You think you know these desert paths, but you've only scratched the surface. There are older trails, secret ways that the miners used, that the indigenous people knew before them. I can show you, but you have to come alone. Bring your next tour group to the old Esperanza mine. I'll be waiting." The Esperanza mine. Montoya knew it by reputation, though he'd never had cause to visit it. Abandoned since the 1920s after a collapse that killed 12 miners, it had been officially sealed by the state in the 1970s. But seal or no seal, determined individuals had ways of accessing such places. The mine was located approximately 4 miles from where the false trail markers had been placed, deep in the restricted area that tourists were explicitly warned to avoid. "Why didn't she report this?" Montoya asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. Guides dealt with occasional odd characters, desert enthusiasts who were harmless if eccentric. Vega had probably dismissed the messages as the ramblings of just another desert rat who'd spent too much time alone in the sun. She mentioned it to me once about a week ago, Rawlings admitted, guilt evident in his voice. Said some guy was being weird, but that it was nothing she couldn't handle. Marisol's tough, Sheriff. She's dealt with everything from flash floods to rattlesnake bites. I never thought. Montoya immediately redirected the search efforts toward the Esperanza mine area. The terrain there was even more challenging than what they'd been dealing with. A landscape of loose shale, hidden drops, and crumbling mining structures that had been baking in the desert sun for nearly a century. If the tour group had been led there, either willingly or under some form of duress, they were in serious danger from both the environment and whoever had lured them off the trail. The helicopter pilot who flew Montoya and his team toward the mine reported seeing something disturbing from the air. "There are fresh tracks leading to the mine entrance," he said over the intercom. "Multiple sets. Looks like a group. But Sheriff, there's something else. There's a vehicle parked about a half-mile from the mine, hidden under camouflage netting. Looks like it's been there for a while." As they approached on foot, the abandoned mine entrance loomed before them like a mouth in the mountainside. The state's seal, a heavy iron gate that should have blocked access, had been cut through with what appeared to be industrial cutting tools. The cuts were not fresh. Rust had already begun to form on the exposed metal, suggesting this had been done weeks or even months ago. Montoya called for backup before entering, but the sounds coming from within the mine made waiting impossible. It was faint, but unmistakable. Someone calling for help, their voice echoing up from the depths of the mountain. He made the decision that would later be questioned by review boards, but which, at the moment, seemed like the only human choice. He entered the mine. The temperature dropped 20 degrees as soon as he passed through the entrance, the sudden coolness almost shocking after the blazing heat outside. His flashlight beam penetrated only a few dozen feet into the darkness before being swallowed by the mountain's interior. The mine shaft extended straight back for about 50 feet before branching into multiple tunnels. Old mining cart tracks, their metal rails twisted and broken in places, disappeared into each passage. "Hello," Montoya called out, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "This is the Pima County Sheriff. Can anyone hear me?" The response came from the left tunnel, clearer now but still distant. It was a woman's voice, possibly Vega's, though the echoes made it difficult to be certain. Montoya advanced carefully, testing each step. The mine floor was littered with debris from the decades-old collapse, rotting timber supports, fragments of rock that had fallen from the ceiling. His flashlight beam caught the reflection of water seeping down the walls, creating slick patches that made footing treacherous. About 100 feet into the left tunnel, he found the first clear evidence of the tour group's presence. A designer handbag, its contents scattered across the mine floor. A wallet, lipstick, prescription medication for high blood pressure. According to his manifest, this belonged to Eleanor Morrison, the Boston retiree whose husband's backpack they had found the night before. The tunnel continued to descend, and Montoya could feel the weight of the mountain pressing down above him. The air grew thicker, harder to breathe, carrying the musty smell of decades of abandonment mixed with something else, something organic and unpleasant. As he rounded a bend in the tunnel, his flashlight beam fell upon a scene that made his blood run cold. 3 members of the tour group were huddled against the tunnel wall, their hands zip-tied together, their mouths covered with duct tape. Eleanor Morrison was there, along with Susan and Richard Patterson from Philadelphia. They were alive, but clearly suffering from severe dehydration and heat exhaustion. Their eyes, wide with terror above the tape, fixed on Montoya with desperate hope. He rushed forward, pulling out his knife to cut their restraints. As he removed the tape from Eleanor Morrison's mouth, She gasped for air and immediately began babbling, her words tumbling over each other in her desperation to communicate. "He made us come here," she gasped. "The man with the rifle. He was waiting when Marisol led us off the trail. Said he'd been planning this for months, studying our tour schedules, learning our routes. He has the others deeper in the mine. Please, you have to help them." "Where's Vega?" Montoya asked, helping the three to their feet. They were weak but mobile, the cool temperature of the mine having potentially saved them from more severe heat stroke. "She tried to fight him," Richard Patterson said, his voice hoarse. "When she realized what was happening, she tried to protect us. He hurt her pretty badly, dragged her deeper into the mine with the others, said something about showing her the real treasures of the desert." Montoya radioed his position to the backup teams that were now entering the mine, then made another difficult decision. He couldn't leave potential victims deeper in the mine while he evacuated these three. He instructed them to move carefully back toward the entrance where they would meet the incoming deputies, then continue deeper into the mountain. The tunnel system was more extensive than the official mine records had indicated. Either the original miners had done significant off-the-books excavation, or someone had been expanding the tunnels more recently. The latter seemed more likely as Montoya noticed modern tool marks on some of the walls and relatively fresh timber supports in certain sections. He found two more tourists in a side chamber, Mark and Lisa Anderson from Washington, D.C., both unconscious but breathing. They showed signs of severe dehydration and possible head trauma. As he was checking their vitals, he heard it, the distinctive sound of a rifle being cocked somewhere in the darkness ahead. "That's far enough, Sheriff," a man's voice called out. It was calm, measured, the voice of someone who felt completely in control of the situation. "I've been expecting you. Well, maybe not you specifically, but someone like you. The desert always sends its guardians eventually." "This is Sheriff Elias Montoya," he responded, keeping his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "Release the remaining hostages and come out peacefully. This doesn't have to end badly." The man laughed, a sound that echoed unnaturally in the tunnel. "End badly? Sheriff, this is just beginning. Do you have any idea what's really hidden in these mountains? What the mining companies found and covered up? What the government doesn't want people to know about?" A conspiracy theorist. Montoya had dealt with them before. Desert dwellers who believed in everything from alien bases to secret government installations hidden in the mountains. But this one had crossed the line from harmless delusion to violent action. "Whatever you believe is hidden here, taking innocent tourists hostage isn't the answer," Montoya said, moving carefully forward, using his flashlight to scan for the source of the voice. "These people have nothing to do with whatever you think is going on." "That's where you're wrong," the voice replied, now from a different direction. The man was moving through the tunnels, using his knowledge of the layout to stay hidden. "These tourists, with their cameras and their GPS devices, they're mapping everything, uploading it all to the cloud. Soon, there won't be any secrets left in the desert. Someone has to stop them." Montoya heard a sound behind him and turned to see his backup arriving, Deputies Martinez and Rodriguez, along with two members of the state police tactical team. He quietly updated them on the situation using hand signals, indicating the direction of the suspect's voice and the presence of additional victims ahead. They advanced in formation, their multiple flashlights creating a web of light that made the shadows dance on the tunnel walls. The passage opened into a larger chamber, partially flooded with groundwater that reflected their lights in murky patterns. On the far side of the chamber they could see him. The man was in his 50s, thin to the point of emaciation, with wild gray hair and eyes that reflected their flashlight beams like an animal's. He held an old hunting rifle. Its barrel pointed at two figures on the ground beside him. One was Marisol Vega, blood matted in her dark hair, semi-conscious. The other was the last missing tourist, Jennifer Hutchinson from Philadelphia, who appeared to be in shock. "Drop the weapon," Deputy Martinez commanded, his service weapon trained on the suspect. The man smiled, a disturbing expression that showed teeth filed to points, a modification that suggested long-term mental instability. "You still don't understand, do you? This mountain is alive. It's been sleeping since they sealed the mine, but I've been feeding it. Small animals at first, then larger ones. It was only a matter of time before it wanted something more." Montoya recognized the signs of severe psychosis, possibly exacerbated by extended isolation and exposure to whatever chemicals might be present in the old mine. Mercury was commonly used in gold processing during the era when this mine was active, and chronic exposure could cause serious neurological effects. "What's your name?" Montoya asked, trying to establish some form of connection with the man. "I had a name once. Thomas Brennan. I was a geologist for the state, surveying these old mines for safety hazards. That was before I found the chamber, the one the original miners sealed off. The one with the symbols on the walls and the bones arranged in patterns. That's when I understood what this place really was." Brennan. Montoya recognized the name from old reports. A state geologist who had disappeared 5 years ago during a survey expedition, presumed dead after his abandoned vehicle was found near the park. Apparently, he had been living in these tunnels the entire time, his mind deteriorating in the darkness. "Thomas, these people need medical attention," Montoya said, taking a slow step forward. "Whatever you've discovered here, it's not worth innocent lives. Let the paramedics help them." Brennan's grip on the rifle tightened. "Innocent. They're contaminating this sacred place with their presence. The mountain demands sacrifice. It's been whispering to me, telling me what it needs." It was Marisol Vega who broke the standoff. Despite her injuries, she suddenly rolled to the side, knocking Brennan's legs out from under him. The rifle discharged, the sound deafening in the enclosed space, the bullet striking the ceiling and showering everyone with rock fragments. In the confusion that followed, the tactical team rushed forward, quickly subduing Brennan before he could recover. As the paramedics worked on the victims and Brennan was taken into custody, Montoya surveyed the chamber more carefully. The walls were indeed covered with strange markings, but they weren't ancient symbols. They were the obsessive scratchings of a disturbed mind, thousands of repetitive marks that Brennan had apparently made during his years of isolation. The bones he had mentioned were there too, but they were from animals, coyotes, javelinas, and other desert creatures that Brennan had apparently been killing and arranging in elaborate patterns. The evacuation of the mine took several hours. All of the tourists survived, though several required extended hospitalization for severe dehydration and heat-related injuries. Marisol Vega suffered a concussion and numerous lacerations but made a full recovery. She would later testify that she had noticed the moved trail markers but had assumed they were correct, trusting in what appeared to be official guidance. The investigation revealed that Thomas Brennan had been living in the mine system for 5 years, surviving on supplies he stole from nearby camps and what he could hunt. His mental state had deteriorated progressively, influenced by isolation, possible mercury exposure, and an obsession with the mine that had consumed his rational thought. He had been watching tour groups for months, learning their patterns, waiting for the perfect opportunity to lead them into his underground domain. The aftermath of the Esperanza mine incident should have been the end of Sheriff Montoya's involvement with the case. The tourists had been rescued. Thomas Brennan was in custody awaiting trial for kidnapping and assault, and the mine had been properly sealed with reinforced concrete barriers that would prevent any future access. But 3 weeks after the rescue, something happened that pulled Montoya back into the mystery of the abandoned mine and forced him to confront the possibility that Brennan's delusions might have contained a grain of truth. It started with a phone call from Dr. Sarah Winters, a University of Arizona archaeologist who had been brought in to document the markings in the mine before it was permanently sealed. She requested a meeting with Montoya, insisting it had to be in person and couldn't be discussed over the phone. Her voice carried an undertone of urgency that immediately set off Montoya's instincts. They met at a small cafe in Tucson, far from the sheriff's usual jurisdiction but neutral ground where they could talk without interruption. Dr. Winters was younger than Montoya had expected, perhaps in her mid-30s, with the kind of intense focus that came from years of academic research. She had brought a laptop and a folder of photographs, which she spread across the table after ensuring they were seated in a corner booth away from other patrons. "Sheriff, I need to show you something about those markings in the mine," she began, pulling up images on her laptop. "When I first saw them, I assumed they were exactly what everyone else did, the obsessive scratching of a disturbed individual. But I've been analyzing them, and there's something underneath Brennan's marks, much older markings that he was apparently tracing over." She showed him enhanced photographs where computer analysis had separated the layers of markings. Beneath Brennan's chaotic scratching were indeed older symbols, carved into the rock with deliberate precision. They appeared to be a mixture of Native American petroglyphs and something else, something that didn't match any known indigenous writing system from the region. "How old?" Montoya asked, though he wasn't sure why it mattered. Ancient markings in the desert weren't unusual. The Southwest was full of archaeological sites. "That's where it gets interesting," Dr. Winters replied, her excitement barely contained. "The style suggests they predate the known Hohokam settlements in this area. We're talking at least 500 years old, possibly older. But that's not the strangest part." She pulled out a map of the region, marked with various colored pins. "I've been researching other abandoned mines in the area looking for similar markings. I found them in 7 other locations, all mines that were abandoned under mysterious circumstances. Each one has records of accidents, disappearances, or strange incidents that led to their closure." Montoya studied the map, noting that the marked locations formed a rough line through the mountains. "What are you suggesting, Doctor?" "I'm not suggesting anything yet," she said carefully. "I'm a scientist, Sheriff. I deal in facts, and the facts are that there's something unusual about these mines. Something that predates modern mining operations by centuries. The indigenous peoples of this region have oral traditions about certain places in the mountains that should be avoided, places where the earth itself is considered dangerous or sacred." She pulled out another photograph, this one showing a chamber deeper in the mine than where they had found the tourists. Montoya didn't remember seeing this area during the rescue operation. "This chamber was behind a partially collapsed wall," Dr. Winters explained. "We found it during our documentation survey. The collapse looked recent, possibly caused by Brennan's activities, but the chamber behind it is old, very old." The photograph showed a circular room carved from solid rock, its walls smooth and covered with the same mysterious symbols. In the center was what appeared to be a well or shaft descending into darkness. Around its edge were arranged stones in a deliberate pattern, each one carved with symbols. "We sent a camera down the shaft," Dr. Winters continued, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "It goes down about 300 feet before opening into a natural cavern system. The caverns show signs of ancient habitation, including what appear to be burial sites. But Sheriff, the remains we glimpsed aren't typical." She showed him the grainy footage from the camera. In the dim light, Montoya could make out what appeared to be bones, but their arrangement and size didn't match anything he would expect. Some seemed too large, others were in positions that didn't make anatomical sense. "We need to go back," Dr. Winters said. "This could be one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in the Southwest, but I need law enforcement support. The site is still technically a crime scene, and there are safety concerns." Montoya's first instinct was to refuse, The mine was sealed for good reasons, and he had no desire to revisit that darkness. But something about the doctor's findings nagged at him. Thomas Brennan had been delusional, certainly, but his obsession with the mine had to have started somewhere. What had he found during his initial geological survey that had driven him to abandon his life and live in those tunnels? Against his better judgment, Montoya agreed to accompany Dr. Winters and her team back to the mine. They would need special permission from multiple agencies, but given the potential archaeological significance, that permission was granted with surprising speed. 2 weeks later, Montoya found himself once again standing at the entrance to the Esperanza mine. This time, he was accompanied not just by Dr. Winters and her archaeological team, but also by representatives from several Native American tribes who had historical connections to the land. The tribal elder, a Tohono O'odham man named Joseph Morales, seemed particularly troubled by their presence. "My grandfather told me stories about this place," Morales said as they prepared to enter. "He said it was a door that should never be opened, that some knowledge is buried for a reason." Despite his misgivings, Morales agreed to accompany them, saying it was better to face such things with proper ceremony and respect than to let them be disturbed by those who didn't understand their significance. The mine felt different this time. Perhaps it was the presence of the archaeological team with their scientific equipment, or perhaps it was knowing what lay deeper in the mountain, but Montoya felt a sense of foreboding that hadn't been there during the rescue operation. The temperature seemed to drop more dramatically as they descended, and sounds echoed in ways that didn't quite match the tunnel's acoustics. When they reached the hidden chamber Dr. Winters had discovered, the tribal elder immediately began performing a protection ceremony, burning sage and speaking in his native language. His actions might have seemed like superstition to some, but Montoya noticed that even the skeptical scientists seemed comforted by the ritual. The chamber was even more impressive in person than in the photographs. The symbols on the walls seemed to shift and move in the flashlight beams, creating an optical illusion that made them appear three-dimensional. The shaft in the center exhaled a cool breeze that carried a mineral smell mixed with something organic and ancient. "We're going to send down more sophisticated equipment this time," Dr. Winters explained, her team setting up an array of cameras, sensors, and sampling devices. "We want to map the entire cavern system and take samples for dating." As they lowered the equipment, Montoya found himself standing next to Joseph Morales, who was studying the symbols on the walls with intense concentration. "Do you recognize any of these?" Montoya asked. "Some are familiar. Variations of symbols my people have used for generations," Morales replied. "But others are older. They speak of things that existed before humans walked this land, things that should remain sleeping." The monitors flickered to life as the cameras descended into the shaft. The cavern system below was more extensive than the initial survey had suggested. Multiple chambers connected by narrow passages, some partially flooded with water that glowed faintly in the camera's lights, suggesting phosphorescent minerals or bacteria. Then they saw the burial chambers. The remains were definitely not typical Native American burials. The bones were arranged in complex patterns, some appearing to be from humans but modified in disturbing ways. Skulls that were elongated far beyond what normal cranial deformation could achieve. Femurs that were too long for any human proportions. And in some cases, bones that didn't match any known human or animal anatomy. "This is extraordinary," Dr. Winters breathed, her scientific excitement overcoming any apprehension. These could be evidence of previously unknown cultural practices, or possibly even an undiscovered branch of human evolution. But Morales was backing away from the monitors, his face pale. "Those are not human remains," he said firmly. "My grandfather was right. This place should have remained sealed." As if in response to his words, the equipment in the shaft began malfunctioning. The cameras flickered, showing brief images of movement in the caverns below, shadows that didn't match any physical objects. The temperature sensors registered impossible readings, showing areas that were simultaneously freezing and burning hot. Then came the sound. It started as a low vibration, felt more than heard, emanating from the shaft. It grew in intensity, becoming a resonance that made everyone's teeth ache and their vision blur. The monitors showed the water in the caverns beginning to move, rippling in patterns that defied the absence of any apparent current. "Pull the equipment up," Montoya ordered, his law enforcement instincts overriding scientific curiosity. "Now," as they frantically winched up their equipment, the sound intensified. Dust began falling from the ceiling, and cracks appeared in the chamber walls. The carefully arranged stones around the shaft's edge began to shift, some falling into the darkness below. They evacuated the chamber quickly but carefully, the archaeological team grabbing what documentation they could. As they retreated through the tunnels, Montoya could hear something behind them, a sound like breathing, but too big to be from any human lungs. The mountain itself seemed to be awakening. They made it out of the mine just as a section of the tunnel collapsed behind them, sealing the chamber once again. Standing in the bright desert sunlight, covered in dust and shaking with adrenaline, the team looked at each other in shocked silence. "What did we just experience?" Dr. Winters asked, her scientific rationality warring with what her senses had told her. Joseph Morales was already walking away, but he paused to look back. "Some doors are sealed for a reason, Doctor. Some knowledge is too dangerous to uncover. The old ones knew this. They sealed that chamber to protect us, not to hide treasure or knowledge, but to keep something contained." The official report on the incident cited seismic activity as the cause of the mine's further collapse, though no earthquakes were recorded in the area that day. The archaeological investigation was quietly discontinued, the findings classified under provisions that Montoya didn't even know existed. Dr. Winters was reassigned to a different project, and her research on the mine disappeared into government archives. 6 months after the mine's final collapse, Sheriff Montoya thought he had put the entire incident behind him. The tourist kidnapping case had been closed with Thomas Brennan sentenced to life in a psychiatric facility. The archaeological investigation had been buried in bureaucracy. The mine itself was now sealed under tons of rock from the collapse. Life in Pima County had returned to its normal rhythm of domestic disputes, drug interdictions, and the occasional lost hiker. But the desert has a way of keeping its secrets close and revealing them when least expected. The call came on a cold December morning, unusual weather for southern Arizona that had brought frost to the saguaro cacti and sent most of the desert wildlife into hiding. Deputy Rodriguez was on the line, his voice tight with confusion and concern. "Sheriff, you need to see this. We've got a situation out at the old Coronado Ranch. The owners called in a missing person report for their son, but what we found, it's connected to the mine incident." The Coronado Ranch sat 15 miles from the Esperanza mine, a working cattle operation that had been in the same family for 4 generations. Montoya knew the owners, Frank and Beth Coronado, good people who minded their own business and rarely called for law enforcement assistance. When he arrived at the ranch, he found the Coronados standing near an old well house on their property, their faces etched with worry. Their 16-year-old son, Miguel, had been missing for 2 days. He'd gone out to check on some cattle in the far pasture and hadn't returned. His horse had come back riderless, which prompted the search. "We found his tracks leading here," Frank Coronado explained, gesturing to the well house. "But Sheriff, this well's been capped for 20 years. There's no reason he would have come here." The well house was a small stone structure, built in the early 1900s when the ranch was first established. The well itself had been sealed with a concrete cap when the ranch switched to a modern water system. But now, that cap had been broken open from below, the concrete shattered outward as if by some tremendous force. Montoya shined his flashlight down the well shaft. It descended about 30 feet to what should have been groundwater, but instead of water, he saw a tunnel opening in the shaft's wall. Fresh tool marks suggested it had been recently excavated. "Has anyone been doing any work out here?" Montoya asked. "No one," Beth Coronado replied. "We haven't had reason to come near this well in years." Miguel knew it was off limits. As Montoya prepared to descend into the well with Deputy Rodriguez and a search and rescue team, Frank Coronado pulled him aside. "Sheriff, there's something else. My grandfather, who founded this ranch, he left journals. He wrote about strange things happening around this well. Workers who went missing, sounds from underground. He's the one who ordered it sealed. Said something about it connecting to old mine tunnels that weren't supposed to exist." Montoya felt a chill that had nothing to do with the unusual cold weather. The Esperanza mine was 15 miles away, but the desert underground was honeycombed with old mining tunnels, natural caves, and aquifer channels. It was possible, even likely, that some of these systems connected. The descent into the well was treacherous. The ladder bolted to the wall was corroded but held their weight. 20 feet down they found the tunnel opening. It was roughly carved, just large enough for a person to crawl through, and it headed east, toward the Esperanza mine. "Miguel!" Montoya called into the tunnel. His voice echoed strangely, seeming to travel much further than it should. After a moment, they heard a response, faint but unmistakable. Someone was calling back. They entered the tunnel, which opened up after about 50 feet into a natural cave system. The walls were limestone, carved by centuries of water flow, creating fantastic formations that glittered in their flashlight beams. But there were also signs of human modification. Support beams, carved steps, even what appeared to be old railroad tracks from mining carts. They found Miguel Coronado 200 yards into the cave system. He was sitting against a wall, his ankle badly twisted, but otherwise unharmed. When he saw them, tears of relief streamed down his face. "I'm sorry," he said immediately. "I didn't mean to come down here, but I heard something calling. It sounded like someone needed help." As they prepared to evacuate Miguel, Montoya noticed something that made his blood run cold. On the wall behind the boy were symbols, the same symbols they had found in the Esperanza mine, and they were fresh, carved within the last few days. "Miguel, did you make these marks?" Montoya asked. The boy looked confused. "What marks?" He genuinely couldn't see them. Deputy Rodriguez confirmed he could see them clearly, but when they asked Miguel to look directly at them, he insisted there was nothing but bare rock. As they helped Miguel toward the exit, Montoya heard it, the same low vibration they had experienced in the mine months earlier. It seemed to be coming from deeper in the cave system, from passages that led into darkness their lights couldn't penetrate. "We need to leave. Now," Montoya ordered. They had made it halfway back to the well shaft when the lights began to fail. Not all at once, but one by one, their flashlights dimmed and died despite fresh batteries. In the growing darkness, Montoya could hear something moving in the tunnels behind them, something large, dragging itself along the stone floor. Then, in the last, flickering light from his dying flashlight, Montoya saw him. Thomas Brennan stood in the tunnel ahead of them. It was impossible. Brennan was in a maximum security psychiatric facility 300 miles away. But there he stood, his eyes reflecting what little light remained like an animal's, his filed teeth visible in a grotesque smile. "You didn't listen," Brennan said, his voice carrying an odd echo as if multiple people were speaking in unison. The mountain doesn't forget. It doesn't forgive. You opened the door, and now it's spreading. You're not here, Montoya said firmly, recognizing this had to be a hallucination, possibly caused by gases in the cave. This isn't real. Brennan laughed, the sound reverberating through the caves. Real? Sheriff, you still don't understand. The barriers between real and unreal are thinner here. The old ones knew this. They used these places to commune with things beyond human understanding. As suddenly as he had appeared, Brennan vanished. The flashlights flickered back to life, revealing empty tunnel where he had stood. But on the ground where his feet should have been, there were wet footprints leading deeper into the cave system. They evacuated quickly, pulling Miguel up through the well shaft into the blessed normalcy of daylight. The boy was taken to the hospital for treatment, and Montoya immediately called the psychiatric facility. Thomas Brennan was there, in his cell, heavily sedated after a violent episode that had occurred at the exact time Montoya had seen him in the cave. That night, Montoya did something he had never done in his career. He filed a false report. Officially, Miguel Coronado had fallen into an old mine shaft while searching for cattle. There was no mention of the symbols, the cave system, or the apparition of Thomas Brennan. He ordered the well sealed with reinforced concrete and had the Coronados post no trespassing signs around the entire area. But the story didn't end there. Over the next 3 months, Montoya tracked a pattern of incidents across southern Arizona. Wells suddenly breaking open from below. Hikers reporting strange sounds from underground. Animals behaving erratically, avoiding certain areas that had previously been part of their regular routes. And, most disturbing, people reporting the same dream. A dream of vast caverns filled with things that had never seen sunlight. Things that were slowly waking up. He met privately with Joseph Morales, the tribal elder who had accompanied them into the mine. Morales was not surprised by what Montoya told him. The old stories speak of this, Morales said. Every few hundred years, the things below grow restless. They probe at the barriers between their world and ours. Usually, they grow quiet again, return to their sleep. But sometimes, if the barriers are weakened enough, they break through. What are they? Montoya asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Nobody knows for certain. My grandfather believed they were the first inhabitants of this land, beings that existed before humans, before most life as we know it. They retreated underground eons ago, but they never left. They're still there, waiting. Montoya made a decision then. Using his connections in law enforcement and the military, he quietly organized a task force to monitor the situation. They mapped every abandoned mine, every natural cave system, every place where the underground world might connect to the surface. They placed seismic sensors to detect unusual underground movement. They created response protocols for incidents that couldn't be explained by conventional means. The task force operated in complete secrecy. The public couldn't know. The panic would be devastating. Tourism was the lifeblood of the region's economy, and stories of ancient things lurking beneath the desert would destroy it. So they watched and waited, responding to incidents with cover stories about gas leaks, seismic activity, or old mine collapses. A year passed, then 2. The incidents gradually decreased, the dreams faded, and the desert seemed to return to normal. The Esperanza mine area was designated a protected wilderness zone, off limits to all civilians. The official reason was environmental protection, but Montoya knew the real purpose was to keep people away from what lay beneath. Thomas Brennan died in the psychiatric facility 2 years after his arrest. The official cause was heart failure, but the attending physician noted in his private records that Brennan's body showed signs of extreme stress, as if he had been terrified to death. His last words, according to the nurse on duty, were, "They're coming through. I can feel them coming through. Sheriff Elias Montoya retired 5 years after the Esperanza mine incident. He moved to Colorado, as far from the desert as he could get while staying in the Southwest. But even there, hundreds of miles from those tunnels, he sometimes woke in the night, certain he could hear that low vibration, feel the mountain breathing, sense things moving in spaces that humans were never meant to discover. He kept in touch with Deputy Rodriguez, who had taken over as sheriff. Rodriguez reported that the incidents had stopped completely, that the underground had gone quiet. But Montoya knew better. The desert was patient. It could wait decades, even centuries. The things below were still there, still watching, still waiting for the next person to move the wrong stone, open the wrong door, or follow the wrong trail into the darkness. In his final journal entry before his death from natural causes at age 74, Montoya wrote, "The tour group that disappeared into the desert that day in 2019, we saved them from Thomas Brennan, but in doing so, we may have awakened something far worse. The moved trail markers weren't just leading them to the mine, they were leading them to specific locations, creating a pattern, a ritual that Brennan didn't fully understand but was compelled to complete. We interrupted that ritual, sealed the mine, and thought we had ended it. But some things once started cannot be stopped, only delayed. The patterns are still there, carved in stone, whispered in dreams, waiting for someone else to complete what Brennan began." To whoever reads this, if you ever find trail markers that seem wrong, if you ever hear sounds from underground that shouldn't exist, if you ever dream of vast caverns and things moving in the darkness, don't investigate. Don't be curious. Turn around, leave, and never speak of it again. Some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. Some doors should never be opened, and some trails should never be followed, no matter where they promise to lead. The desert keeps its secrets for a reason. The journal was found among Montoya's effects after his death and was quietly transferred to the classified archives of the task force he had created. The task force still exists, still monitors, still waits. They know that someday someone will move the wrong stone, follow the wrong trail, or dig in the wrong place. And when that happens, when the barriers finally break, they'll be ready. Or at least they hope they will be. Because in the deepest parts of the desert, in the places where shadows gather and the earth itself seems to breathe, something waits. It has waited since before humans walked this land, and it will wait long after they're gone. The moved trail markers were just the beginning, a test, a probe at the boundaries between worlds. The real horror isn't what happened to that tour group in 2019. The real horror is what their rescue prevented, and what it may have only postponed. Somewhere in the Sonoran Desert, in the abandoned mines and hidden caves in the spaces between what we know and what we fear, the darkness gathers its strength, and one day it will try again. Deputy Sheriff Clara Sandoval had been serving with the Cochise County Sheriff's Department for 9 years. Night patrols along the Arizona-Mexico border were spent in the eerie, endless darkness, where criminal activity was rampant. Though she never admitted it to anyone, this situation unsettled her. What bothered her most were not the drug smugglers or human traffickers. What truly unsettled her were the desert's endless voids, the darkness transforming familiar things into strange shapes, and the sounds carried for miles in the still air, distorted and amplified. On this particular October night in 2020, the temperature had dropped to an unseasonable 45 degrees, cold enough to make her grateful for the heater in her patrol vehicle. She was accompanied by Hector Aranda, a civilian volunteer with the Sheriff's Auxiliary Program. Hector was in his early 40s, a former Marine who had settled in Bisbee after his service and now ran a small auto repair shop. He volunteered for night patrols twice a month, providing an extra set of eyes and local knowledge that proved invaluable in this sprawling county of over 6,000 square miles. They were driving along State Route 80, about 15 miles southeast of Tombstone, when the first call came in. The dispatcher's voice crackled through the radio with the familiar professional calm that could make even the most disturbing reports sound routine. Unit 7, we've got multiple reports of strange lights and sounds coming from the old Brennan property off mile marker 47. Callers describe flickering lights and what sounds like screaming. Can you investigate? Clara exchanged a glance with Hector. The Brennan property had been abandoned for nearly 5 years, ever since Old Man Brennan died, and his children, living in Phoenix and Los Angeles, had let the ranch fall into disrepair while they fought over the inheritance. The place had become a magnet for trouble, teenagers looking for a place to party, transients seeking shelter, and occasionally more serious criminal activity. Unit 7 responding. Clara replied into the radio. ETA approximately 15 minutes. She turned off the highway onto the dirt road that led to the property, the patrol vehicle's headlights cutting through the darkness to illuminate the rough track ahead. The road hadn't been maintained in years, and recent monsoon rains had carved deep ruts that made navigation treacherous even at low speed. I knew Jim Brennan, Hector said quietly as they bounced along the road. Good man, worked that ranch for 40 years. Would break his heart to see what it's become. As they crested a small rise, they could see the property in the distance, and Clara immediately understood why multiple people had called it in. Lights were indeed visible, but not the steady glow of electric lights or even the flickering of a campfire. These were erratic, moving lights that appeared and disappeared seemingly at random, sometimes bright white, sometimes with a reddish tinge, and carried on the cold night air, they could hear sounds that made the hair on the back of Clara's neck stand up. It did sound like screaming, but not quite. The sounds were distorted, rising and falling in pitch. Sometimes multiple voices overlapping in a cacophony that seemed almost orchestrated. Clara had heard plenty of screams in her career, from accident victims to domestic violence situations, but this was different. These sounds had an quality to them, as if the people making them were not entirely in control of their own voices. Could be coyotes, Hector suggested, though his tone indicated he didn't believe it himself. Sometimes they can sound almost human, especially when there's a pack of them. Clara knew he was trying to rationalize what they were hearing, and she appreciated the effort. But they both knew coyotes didn't make lights, and the sounds, while eerie, had a distinctly human quality to them. They parked the patrol vehicle about a quarter mile from the main ranch buildings, not wanting to announce their approach too obviously. Clara called in their position to dispatch, then she and Hector proceeded on foot, their flashlights off, relying on the moonlight to navigate. The waning moon provided just enough illumination to see the outlines of buildings ahead. The main house, a large barn, several outbuildings, and what looked like an old bunkhouse for ranch hands. The lights were coming from the barn. That much was clear now. They could see shadows moving against the walls, cast by whatever light sources were inside. The sounds had changed too, becoming less like screams and more like singing? Chanting? Clara couldn't quite place it, but there was definitely a rhythm to it now, almost ceremonial. They approached the barn from the side, moving carefully to avoid the scattered debris and rusted farm equipment that littered the property. Clara had her hand on her service weapon but hadn't drawn it yet. Despite the strange nature of the call, she had learned over the years not to assume the worst. More often than not, what seemed sinister or dangerous turned out to be sad or pathetic. Homeless camps, addicts getting high, mentally ill individuals off their medication. When they reached the barn wall, Clara could hear individual voices now. Multiple people, speaking in Spanish mostly, but also English and what might have been indigenous languages she didn't recognize. The tone varied wildly, from angry shouting to desperate pleading to something that sounded almost like prayer. She and Hector moved to a gap in the barn's siding where they could see inside without being immediately visible themselves. What they saw made Clara reach for her radio to call for backup. Inside the barn, lit by several oil lanterns and what looked like burning trash in metal barrels, were approximately 20 people. But they weren't gathered together as a single group. Instead, they appeared to be divided into two distinct camps on opposite sides of the barn's interior, with a clear no-man's land between them. On one side were what appeared to be homeless individuals, their clothing layered and dirty, their possessions in shopping carts and torn backpacks. Several were clearly intoxicated or under the influence of something stronger than alcohol. On the other side were people who looked like migrant workers, their clothing worn but cleaner, many still wearing work boots and the kind of practical clothing used for agricultural labor. The tension between the two groups was palpable, even from outside. They were shouting at each other across the divide, gesturing aggressively, and Clara could see that several individuals on both sides were armed with makeshift weapons, pieces of rebar, broken bottles, farm tools. "This is about to go bad," Hector whispered. "We need more units." Clara agreed and was about to key her radio when movement in the loft above caught her attention. There were more people up there, at least 5 or 6, and they seemed to be from a third group entirely. These individuals were better dressed, watching the conflict below with what appeared to be interest rather than concern. One of them was holding what looked like a camera, recording the scene. Before Clara could process this new information, the situation in the barn exploded. Someone from the homeless camp threw a bottle that shattered near the migrant workers. In response, one of the workers charged across the divide with a shovel raised above his head. Within seconds, the barn erupted into violence. "All units, Code 3 backup needed at the Brennan Ranch." Clara spoke rapidly into her radio. Multiple individuals engaged in violent confrontation. At least 20 subjects, possibly more. She and Hector had to make a decision. Wait for backup, which could take 20 minutes or more given their remote location, or try to intervene before someone was seriously hurt or killed. The screams now were real. No longer the eerie sounds that had drawn them here, but the very human cries of pain and fear. Clara drew her weapon and fired 2 shots into the air through the open barn door. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space, and it had the desired effect. The fighting stopped immediately, everyone freezing in place and turning toward the door. "Sheriff's Department," Clara announced loudly, stepping into view with her weapon at low ready. "Everyone stop what you're doing and sit down on the ground, now." For a moment, she thought they might comply. Several people did begin to lower themselves to the ground. But then someone in the loft shouted something in a language Clara didn't understand, and chaos erupted again. This time, instead of fighting each other, both groups scattered in all directions. People burst out of every exit, including several Clara hadn't even noticed. They ran into the darkness of the desert, their forms quickly swallowed by the night. Clara and Hector tried to contain the scene, but it was like trying to hold water in their hands. Within 30 seconds, the barn was almost empty except for 3 individuals who were too injured to run, and 2 others who seemed too intoxicated or disoriented to understand what was happening. "Check the injured," Clara told Hector, while she tried to pursue at least some of the fleeing subjects. But it was hopeless. In the darkness, with the rough terrain and multiple directions of escape, she could only watch as taillights appeared in the distance where vehicles had apparently been hidden. When she returned to the barn, Hector had triaged the injured. One man had a deep laceration on his arm that was bleeding significantly. Another had what appeared to be a broken nose and possibly a concussion. The third was a woman who had been trampled in the chaos and was holding her ribs. breathing in short, painful gasps. "We need ambulances," Hector said, already applying pressure to the bleeding man's arm with a torn shirt. Clara called for medical support, then began to process the scene while they waited. The barn told a story of desperation and conflict. On the homeless camp's side, she found the typical detritus of transient living. Sleeping bags, shopping carts filled with recyclables, empty alcohol bottles, and drug paraphernalia. But there were also signs of longer-term habitation, including a makeshift kitchen area and what looked like an attempt at organizing a communal living space. The migrant workers' side was different. There were bedrolls laid out in neat rows, work clothes hung on improvised lines, and several bags of what looked like personal belongings carefully organized. Clara found pay stubs from several local ranches, suggesting these were documented workers, not the undocumented immigrants she had initially assumed. But it was what she found in the loft that proved most disturbing. The people who had been watching from above had left in such haste that they'd abandoned several items, including the camera that had been recording the fight. Clara picked it up, a professional-grade digital video camera, and rewound the footage. What she saw made her stomach turn. The camera had been recording for hours, documenting not just the fight they had interrupted, but the entire evening's events. The footage showed someone deliberately instigating conflict between the two groups, providing alcohol to the homeless individuals, and spreading rumors to the workers that their possessions had been stolen. It was like watching someone carefully orchestrate a violent confrontation for the sole purpose of recording it. "Clara, you need to see this," Hector called from the other end of the barn. She joined him at what had once been a feed storage area but had been converted into something else entirely. The walls were covered with maps of the county, marked with different colored pins. There were photographs of various locations, all appearing to be abandoned properties like this ranch. And there were lists of names divided into categories: transients, workers, useful, expendable. "What the hell is this?" Hector asked. Before Clara could respond, her radio crackled with an urgent message from dispatch. There were reports of similar confrontations at two other abandoned properties in the county, both following the same pattern: lights and sounds drawing law enforcement attention, then violence between different groups of society's most vulnerable people. As backup units began arriving at the Brennan Ranch, Clara realized they had stumbled onto something much larger than a simple confrontation between desperate people seeking shelter. Someone was orchestrating these conflicts, using abandoned properties as staging grounds, and treating human misery as entertainment, or worse. She thought about the lights that had drawn them here, how they had seemed almost designed to attract attention. The sounds that had been just disturbing enough to generate multiple 911 calls. It was as if someone had wanted law enforcement to respond, but only after the situation had reached a certain point of volatility. "We need to find out who was in that loft," Clara told Hector, as paramedics began treating the injured. "And we need to check those other properties before more people get hurt." But even as she said it, Clara knew they were already playing catch-up to someone who had planned this carefully. The abandoned camera might provide clues, but whoever was behind this had been smart enough to avoid being on camera themselves. They were dealing with someone who understood law enforcement response times, who knew which properties were abandoned and unmonitored, and who had no qualms about manipulating society's most vulnerable people for their own purposes. As she stood in the barn, now illuminated by the flashing lights of multiple emergency vehicles, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The maps on the wall had shown dozens of marked locations. If each one was a potential site for this kind of orchestrated conflict, they were looking at a crisis that could stretch their department's resources to the breaking point. The sun was just beginning to rise over the Chiricahua Mountains as Clara sat in the sheriff's department conference room, surrounded by evidence from what the media had already dubbed the border battles, though Clara knew that name missed the true nature of what they were dealing with. 3 nights had passed since the incident at the Brennan Ranch, and the pattern was becoming disturbingly clear. Sheriff Robert Mason, a 30-year veteran who had seen everything from cartel violence to malicious standoffs, looked exhausted as he addressed the assembled team. Besides Clara and Hector, who had been officially deputized given the scope of the crisis, there were 6 other deputies, 2 state police liaisons, and an FBI agent named David Park, who had driven down from Phoenix when it became clear this crossed multiple jurisdictions. 7 incidents in 3 nights, Mason began, his voice gravelly from lack of sleep. 43 injuries, thankfully no deaths yet, though we've got 2 people in critical condition at the medical center. What do we know? Clara stood up, moving to the whiteboard where she had mapped out the incidents. Each abandoned property was marked with a red pin, connected by lines that showed the progression of events. The pattern is consistent, she began. Each incident follows the same timeline. First, vulnerable populations, homeless individuals, migrant workers, sometimes addicts or people with mental health issues, begin gathering at abandoned properties. This happens over the course of several days or even weeks. They're drawn there by rumors of available shelter, work opportunities, or in some cases, free food and supplies. She pointed to photographs taken from the various scenes. Once a critical mass is reached, usually between 15 and 30 people, divisions are deliberately created. Sometimes it's along ethnic lines, sometimes economic, sometimes just arbitrary groups. Alcohol and drugs are introduced to one or both groups. Rumors are spread. Possessions go missing, only to turn up with the other group. Then come the lights and sounds, Hector added from his seat. Designed to draw attention, to bring law enforcement or concerned citizens to investigate. But by the time we arrive, the conflict has already been orchestrated to the breaking point. Agent Park leaned forward. The camera you recovered from the Brennan Ranch has been analyzed. Whoever was recording knew exactly what they were doing. Professional quality footage, multiple angles when compared with other cameras we've found, and careful editing to highlight the most violent moments. This isn't just documentation, it's production. Clara felt a chill at his words. They had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed made it somehow worse. Someone was producing human misery as entertainment, using real people, real violence, real suffering. There's more, Park continued. We've traced the serial numbers on some of the equipment. Purchased with cash at various stores across 3 states, but always with the same pattern. Buyer is described as middle-aged, white, male, unremarkable. Pays cash, doesn't engage in conversation, never caught clearly on security cameras. Sheriff Mason stood up, his frustration evident. So we've got someone turning abandoned properties into fight clubs for the desperate, recording it all, and we don't even have a clear description. How is that possible in this day and age? Clara had been wondering the same thing. In her experience, criminals, especially those operating on this scale, made mistakes. They got overconfident, left evidence, or were betrayed by accomplices. But this perpetrator seemed to be operating with an unusual level of sophistication. I might have something, Clara said, pulling out a folder she had been compiling. I've been interviewing the injured and those we managed to detain. Most don't know much, but there's a consistent thread. They all mention being approached by someone they call El Facilitador, the facilitator. Never the same physical person, but always someone who knows exactly what they need: work, shelter, food, medical care, and can provide information on where to find it. She spread out several witness sketches on the table. They showed different people, various ages and ethnicities, but all with one common feature. They all wore similar clothing. Dark work clothes with a particular logo that none of the witnesses could quite remember clearly. I think we're dealing with a network, Clara continued. Not just one person, but an organization. They have scouts who identify vulnerable populations, facilitators who guide them to the properties, instigators who create the conflicts, and then the production team that records everything. To what end? Deputy Martinez asked. Are they selling these videos? Dark web stuff? Agent Park shook his head. We've been monitoring those channels. Nothing matching this has surfaced for sale. Whatever the purpose, it's not simple profit, at least not in the traditional sense. It was Hector who voiced what Clara had been thinking. What if it's not about money? What if it's about the chaos itself? Or worse, what if this is practice for something bigger? The room fell silent as the implications sank in. If someone was orchestrating violence between vulnerable populations as practice or testing, what was the ultimate goal? Before anyone could respond, Clara's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. She was about to ignore it when she saw the preview. Check the old Fairbank ghost town, tonight. Come alone if you want answers. She showed the message to Sheriff Mason, who immediately shook his head. Absolutely not. This could be a trap. But Clara had already made up her mind. Fairbank was an actual ghost town, abandoned since the 1970s, about 10 miles west of Tombstone. It was isolated enough that backup would be far away, but public enough that it seemed an unlikely place for an ambush. Sir, with all due respect, we're not making progress with traditional methods, Clara argued. Whoever this is, they know our procedures, our response times, our protocols. Maybe it's time to break pattern. The debate continued for another hour, but eventually a compromise was reached. Clara would go to Fairbank, but not alone. She would be wired, with backup stationed just outside visual range, and Hector would accompany her as her visible backup. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than letting the lead go cold. That night, as they drove toward Fairbank, the desert seemed particularly hostile. The temperature had dropped again, unusual for October, and a wind had picked up, sending tumbleweeds across the road like fleeting ghosts. The ghost town itself was a collection of ruined buildings barely visible in the moonlight. The old commercial company store, the schoolhouse, the handful of residences that had once housed the town's 100 or so residents. They parked at the entrance and proceeded on foot, their flashlights creating dancing shadows among the ruins. Clara's wire transmitted every sound back to the command post established 2 miles away, where Sheriff Mason and Agent Park monitored their progress. Movement, northwest corner of the schoolhouse, Hector whispered, his Marine training evident in the way he moved through the debris-strewn streets. Clara saw it too, a figure standing in the shadows of the old building. As they approached, the figure stepped into the moonlight, and Clara's hand instinctively went to her weapon. It was a woman, perhaps in her 30s, dressed in dark clothing that bore the logo several witnesses had tried to describe. A stylized eye, surrounded by lightning bolts. She held her hands up, showing she was unarmed. "Deputy Sandoval," the woman said, her voice carrying a slight accent Clara couldn't place. "Thank you for coming. You can tell your backup I'm not a threat. I'm here to provide information, nothing more." "Who are you?" Clara demanded, not relaxing her vigilance. "Call me Anna. Was part of what you're investigating, but I can't continue being part of it. What started as something else has become monstrous." "What started as what?" Hector asked, positioning himself to cover Clara while she focused on the woman. Anna sighed, seeming to age years in that moment. "Social experiment, that's what they called it. Studying conflict dynamics in marginalized populations. How disputes escalate, what triggers violence, how authority intervention affects outcomes. It was supposed to be academic, funded by think tanks and private research organizations interested in conflict resolution." Clara felt her anger rising. "Academic? People are dying." I know, Anna shot back, tears now visible on her cheeks. It wasn't supposed to be like this. We were supposed to observe, document, maybe facilitate meetings between groups to study natural conflict progression. But he changed everything. He turned it into something else. Who? Clara pressed. Who's running this? Anna looked around nervously as if expecting someone to materialize from the shadows. Dr. Marcus Vance. He used to be a professor of sociology at Stanford, specializing in conflict studies. He was dismissed 5 years ago for conducting unauthorized experiments on students, but he found private funding to continue his work. Only now, his laboratory is the entire border region, and his subjects are the people nobody cares about. Clara's mind was racing. Finally, they had a name, a real lead. But Anna wasn't finished. He has a compound, Anna continued, speaking quickly now as if afraid she would lose her nerve. It's in the Pelanchillo Mountains, about 40 miles from here. An old mining camp he's converted into his base of operations. That's where he reviews the footage, plans the next incidents, and trains his facilitators. How many people are involved? Hector asked. At least 30 directly, maybe more indirectly. Some think they're doing legitimate research. Others know exactly what's happening and don't care. The money is too good, and the people being hurt. She trailed off, shame evident in her expression. Are people nobody cares about? Clara finished bitterly. Anna nodded. Vance calls them acceptable losses. Says their suffering serves a greater purpose, that understanding conflict dynamics could prevent wars, stop genocides. He genuinely believes he's doing important work. And the violence, the injuries? Clara demanded. Unintended, but not unexpected outcomes, according to him. He documents everything meticulously. Every injury is cataloged, analyzed, compared against his models. He's building a massive database of human conflict behavior. Clara keyed her radio, transmitting this information back to the command post. They needed to move on this compound immediately, before Vance could destroy evidence or disappear. But Anna held up her hand. There's something else, something worse. The border conflicts, they're just phase 1. Vance has been in contact with groups in major cities, Los Angeles, Phoenix, Houston. He's planning to scale up, to orchestrate larger conflicts in urban areas where the population density will magnify the effects. When? Clara asked, urgency in her voice. Soon, within the week. He has facilitators already in place, identifying vulnerable populations in homeless camps, immigrant communities, anywhere people are desperate and divided. The footage from the border incidents is just proof of concept for his investors. Investors? Hector said, incredulity in his voice. Who would invest in this? Anna shrugged. People who profit from chaos. Foreign governments interested in destabilizing American communities. Extremist groups wanting to spark racial conflicts. Media companies that thrive on violence. Vance doesn't care where the money comes from as long as it funds his research. She pulled out a flash drive from her pocket and handed it to Clara. Everything I know is on here. Locations, personnel, financial records. I'm leaving tonight, disappearing. I suggest you move fast. Vance has sources in law enforcement. He'll know I've talked to you. Before Clara could ask anything else, Anna turned and walked into the darkness, quickly disappearing among the ruins. Clara and Hector stood there for a moment, the weight of what they'd learned settling on them like the desert cold. We need to get back, Clara said finally. If she's right about the timeline, we don't have much time. As they drove back toward the command post, Clara couldn't help but think about all the abandoned properties scattered across the border region, each one a potential stage for Vance's sick experiments. Each one filled with desperate people who thought they had found shelter, not knowing they were being manipulated into violence for the sake of data points in some madman's research. The flash drive felt heavy in her pocket, weighted with evidence of crimes that went beyond simple assault or incitement. This was systematic exploitation of society's most vulnerable, turning poverty and desperation into a laboratory for studying human misery. The Pelonchillo Mountains straddled the Arizona-New Mexico border like a massive spine of rock and desert scrub, a remote wilderness that had historically harbored everyone from Apache warriors to modern drug smugglers. It was the perfect location for someone who wanted to operate without interference, and as Clara studied the satellite images of Vance's compound on her laptop, she understood why he had chosen this place. The operation to raid the compound had taken 3 days to organize. The flash drive Anna had provided contained a wealth of information, including detailed layouts of the facility, personnel files, and most disturbingly, video files showing the full extent of Vance's experiments. The FBI had taken over the investigation, but Sheriff Mason had insisted that Clara and her team remain involved given their familiarity with the case. It was 3 a.m. when the Joint Task Force assembled at a staging area 15 miles from the compound. 50 law enforcement officers from various agencies, including a FBI tactical team, state police, and selected deputies from Cochise County. Clara was assigned to the secondary entry team, tasked with securing evidence while the tactical team neutralized any resistance. Agent Park, who was leading the operation, conducted the final briefing. The compound consists of 6 buildings arranged around a central courtyard. Intelligence suggests between 20 and 35 individuals on site. Most are researchers and support staff who may not pose a threat, but we have identified at least 8 security personnel, all with military or law enforcement backgrounds. He pointed to the largest building on the satellite image. This is our primary target, the main research facility where Vance maintains his command center. We expect to find him there, along with the servers containing his research data. Secondary teams will secure the barracks, the equipment storage, and what appears to be a detention facility on the eastern edge of the compound. Clara felt her stomach tighten at the mention of a detention facility. The videos on Anna's flash drive had shown glimpses of people being held in cells. Apparently, subjects for more controlled experiments when the chaos of the abandoned properties didn't provide the specific data Vance wanted. Rules of engagement are clear, Park continued. We're going in loud and fast. Anyone who surrenders will be detained peacefully. Anyone who resists, well, let's hope it doesn't come to that. As they loaded into the vehicles for the approach, Hector, who had been deputized for this operation given his military experience, sat next to Clara. You ready for this? He asked. Clara nodded, though readiness was relative. She'd been in dangerous situations before, but this felt different. They weren't just confronting criminals. They were dismantling an entire organization that had turned human suffering into a science project. The approach to the compound was done in complete darkness, night vision equipment turning the desert into an eerie green landscape. The compound appeared suddenly as they crested a ridge, a cluster of lights in the vast darkness that looked almost like a small town from a distance. All teams, this is command. Park's voice came through the radio. We are go for insertion. I repeat, we are go. The vehicles accelerated, racing toward the compound's main gate. Clara could hear the distant sound of a battering ram breaching the entrance, followed immediately by flashbang grenades and shouting. The tactical team was inside. Clara's team held back, waiting for the initial chaos to subside before moving in. Through the radio, she could hear the tactical team's progress. Building 1 secure, 3 subjects detained. Building 2 encountering resistance. Shots fired. Shots fired. After what felt like hours, but was actually only minutes, the call came for secondary teams to enter. Clara and her team moved through the breached gate into a scene of controlled chaos. Tactical officers had individuals face down on the ground, hands zip-tied behind their backs. The acrid smell of tear gas lingered in the air. Clara's team headed directly for the main research building. Inside, they found a facility that looked more like a high-tech corporation than a criminal compound. Clean white walls, modern computer equipment, conference rooms with smart boards covered in complex diagrams and equations. In the main control room, they found what they had come for. Banks of servers hummed quietly, storing terabytes of data from Vance's experiments. Multiple monitors showed feeds from cameras at various abandoned properties across the Southwest, some still active, recording empty buildings and desert landscapes. "My God," Hector said, staring at one wall that was covered with photographs, hundreds of them, all showing injured people from the orchestrated conflicts. They were organized like a morbid gallery, categorized by type of injury, severity, and what appeared to be ratings for research value. Clara moved to the desk at the center of the room, where several journals lay open. Vance's handwriting was neat, precise, almost compulsive in its organization. She began reading his most recent entry. Day 1227 of the project. The escalation in urban environments remains the logical next step. Rural conflicts have provided baseline data, but population density is a crucial variable that must be tested. The suffering of a few hundred individuals in the desert is regrettable but necessary to prevent the suffering of millions in future conflicts. History will vindicate this work. "Clara, you need to see this," a voice called from the adjoining room. She found Deputy Martinez standing in front of a locked door that had been forced open. Inside was Vance's personal office, and it was here that the full scope of his delusion became apparent. The walls were covered with academic articles, news clippings about wars and genocides, and what appeared to be rejection letters from dozens of academic journals and grant committees. On his desk was a manuscript titled "The Mathematics of Human Conflict," a comprehensive model for predicting and preventing violence. It was thousands of pages long, filled with equations, diagrams, and statistical analyses derived from the suffering he had orchestrated. But Vance himself was nowhere to be found. "Command, this is Sandoval," Clara radioed. "The main research facility is secure, but there's no sign of Vance." "Copy that." Park's voice came back. "We're still clearing buildings. Stand by." As Clara continued to search Vance's office, she found something that made her blood run cold. It was a folder marked Phase 3, International Deployment. Inside were communications with unknown parties in various countries, discussing the possibility of exporting Vance's methodology to conflict zones around the world. The implication was clear. Vance wasn't just studying conflict, he was preparing to franchise it. A commotion outside drew her attention. Through the window, she could see tactical officers escorting someone from a building on the compound's edge. Even from a distance, she could tell from the person's bearing and the way the officers were handling him that this was someone important. Clara ran outside, arriving just as the officers brought the individual into the light. It was a man in his 60s, thin to the point of gauntness, with wild gray hair and eyes that held a disturbing intensity. This had to be Marcus Vance. But as Clara got closer, she realized something was wrong. The man was laughing, a high, unhinged sound that sent chills down her spine. "You're too late," he said, between fits of laughter. "It's already begun, Los Angeles, Phoenix, Houston. The facilitators are in place. The populations are gathered. The conflicts are primed. You can't stop it now." Agent Park grabbed Vance by the shoulders. "What are you talking about? When? Where exactly?" Vance just smiled, an expression that held no warmth, only a twisted satisfaction. "Tonight, tomorrow, the next day. Staggered deployment to prevent intervention. Dozens of locations in each city, homeless camps, immigrant communities, wherever desperation has reached critical mass. You'd need thousands of officers to stop them all, and by the time you mobilize, the data will be collected, the experiment complete. Clara felt a sick feeling in her stomach. If Vance was telling the truth, they were facing a coordinated series of orchestrated conflicts across multiple major cities. The casualties could be in the hundreds, possibly thousands. "Get him to interrogation," Park ordered. "We need every location, every facilitator, every detail." As Vance was led away, still laughing, Clara turned to Hector. "We need to get this information out immediately. Every law enforcement agency in those cities needs to be warned." The next hours were a blur of activity. The compound was systematically searched and documented. 28 individuals were arrested, ranging from security personnel to researchers who had knowingly participated in Vance's experiments. The detention facility on the compound's edge yielded the most horrific discoveries. 12 individuals who had been held for controlled testing, essentially human lab rats for Vance's theories on conflict escalation. These victims, all homeless individuals or undocumented immigrants who wouldn't be missed, had been subjected to various psychological stressors to measure their breaking points. They were malnourished, traumatized, and in some cases barely coherent. Medical teams worked to stabilize them while investigators documented their conditions. In the compound's equipment storage, they found an arsenal of recording equipment, thousands of hours of footage from the orchestrated conflicts, and detailed files on hundreds of subjects, vulnerable individuals who had been unknowingly participating in Vance's experiments. But it was in the server room that they found the most crucial intelligence. Vance's entire database, years of research, was stored there. But more importantly, the servers contained the operational plans for the urban deployments he had threatened. Specific locations, times, and methods for inciting violence in homeless camps and immigrant communities across 3 major cities. Clara worked with FBI cyber specialists to decode the information, racing against time to prevent the urban incidents. The plans were meticulous, identifying exactly which groups to target, what rumors to spread, what resources to provide to create maximum conflict potential. "Jesus," one of the specialists muttered as he scrolled through the plans. "He's got psychological profiles on hundreds of people, knows exactly which buttons to push to make them violent." As dawn broke over the desert, painting the mountains in shades of orange and pink that would have been beautiful under different circumstances, the full scope of what they had uncovered was becoming clear. Vance hadn't just been studying conflict, he had been weaponizing it, turning sociology into a tool for orchestrated chaos. The Emergency Operations Center in Phoenix was a hive of activity when Clara arrived, having been helicoptered directly from the compound, along with Agent Park and the critical intelligence they had extracted from Vance's servers. The large conference room had been converted into a command center, with representatives from law enforcement agencies across 3 states coordinating the massive effort to prevent Vance's urban deployment. FBI Assistant Director Michelle Rodriguez stood at the center of it all, orchestrating resources with the efficiency of a military general. Multiple screens showed maps of Los Angeles, Phoenix, and Houston, with red pins marking the locations Vance's facilitators had identified for conflict orchestration. "We have 47 potential sites across the 3 cities," Rodriguez announced to the assembled team. "Based on Vance's timeline, we believe at least a dozen are already active, meaning facilitators have begun gathering vulnerable populations and creating division." Clara studied the Phoenix map, noting that several sites were in areas she knew well from her years in law enforcement. The largest was a homeless encampment near the Salt River that had grown to over 200 individuals in recent months. According to Vance's files, his facilitators had been working there for 3 weeks, systematically dividing the camp into ethnic groups and spreading rumors of theft and violence between them. The challenge, Rodriguez continued, is that we can't simply arrest everyone. Many of these people are victims who don't even know they're being manipulated. We need to neutralize the facilitators and diffuse the conflicts without creating panic or actual violence. Agent Park pulled Clara aside. We need you in Phoenix. You've studied Vance's methods more closely than anyone. You understand how these conflicts are orchestrated. Help us identify the facilitators and figure out how to counter their tactics. Clara nodded, though exhaustion was weighing heavily on her. She had been running on adrenaline for days, and the thought of preventing dozens of potential violent incidents across multiple cities seemed overwhelming. Hector, who had accompanied her to Phoenix, placed a steady hand on her shoulder. We've come this far. Let's finish this. The Phoenix operation was assigned 6 locations to monitor and intervene if necessary. Clara was paired with a local detective named James Thompson, a 20-year veteran who knew the city's vulnerable populations well. Their first stop was the Salt River encampment. As they approached in an unmarked vehicle, Clara could immediately see signs of Vance's influence. The camp, which Thompson said had previously been a relatively cohesive community despite its challenges, was now clearly divided. Makeshift barriers had been erected between different sections. Groups of people stood in clusters, eyeing each other with suspicion and hostility. "This is worse than I expected," Thompson muttered. "I know some of these people. They've lived here peacefully for months, even years. Now look at them." Clara spotted what she was looking for. Individuals who didn't quite fit, whose clothes were too clean, whose manner was too purposeful. Vance's facilitators. She counted at least 3 moving through the camp, and from their positioning, they were preparing for something. "We need to move now," she told Thompson. "They're getting ready to trigger something." They called for backup, but Clara knew they couldn't wait. She and Thompson entered the camp, trying to appear casual while moving toward the nearest facilitator. The woman was in her 30s, wearing the same type of dark work clothes with the eye and lightning logo that Anna had shown them. As they approached, the facilitator saw them and immediately reached for something in her pocket. Clara managed to intercept her, grabbing her wrist before she could retrieve what turned out to be a small incendiary device. "Police! Nobody move!" Thompson shouted, his badge visible. The effect was immediate, but not what they had hoped. The camp erupted in chaos, not violence between groups but a panicked scramble as people fled in all directions, convinced that this was an immigration raid or arrest sweep. In the confusion, 2 of the facilitators escaped, disappearing into the urban landscape beyond the camp. But they had prevented the orchestrated conflict, and the facilitator Clara had grabbed was in custody. Her name was Rachel Morrison, and under interrogation, she revealed crucial information about the coordination of the urban deployment. "It's all synchronized," Morrison said, seemingly eager to talk when she realized the scope of law enforcement's response. "Every facilitator has a specific timeline. Create division over 2 to 3 weeks, introduce catalysts like drugs or weapons, then trigger the conflict at predetermined times to overwhelm emergency services." "Why?" Clara asked. "What's the purpose beyond Vance's research?" Morrison's answer chilled her. Vance promised different things to different investors. To some, it was about studying conflict to prevent it. To others, it was about creating chaos to justify law enforcement crackdowns or anti-immigrant policies. To the foreign investors, it was about destabilizing American cities. Vance didn't care about their agendas as long as they funded his research. Across the 3 cities, similar scenes played out as law enforcement intervened at Vance's targeted sites. Some interventions were successful, preventing conflicts before they began. Others arrived too late, finding violent confrontations already underway. The final tally was sobering: 18 prevented incidents, 7 partial interventions where violence was contained, and 4 sites where full-scale conflicts erupted before authorities arrived. The human cost was significant: 43 injured seriously enough to require hospitalization, 2 deaths, one from a stabbing, another from a heart attack during a confrontation, and hundreds traumatized by violence they never saw coming. Back at the Emergency Operations Center, Clara watched news reports of the incidents. The media was struggling to make sense of what appeared to be spontaneous violence erupting across multiple cities simultaneously. Some outlets were already spinning conspiracy theories about coordinated attacks, while others blamed social conditions and poverty. None of them knew the truth: that a single man's twisted vision of scientific research had turned society's most vulnerable into unwitting subjects in a massive, violent experiment. Vance himself proved to be a disturbing interview subject. Now, in federal custody, he showed no remorse for the death and suffering he had caused. In recorded interrogation sessions, he maintained that his work was vital for understanding human conflict. "You think I'm a monster," he told his interrogators. "But I'm a scientist. Every war, every genocide, every riot happens because we don't understand the mechanics of human conflict. I was providing that understanding, the suffering of hundreds to save millions. It's a reasonable exchange." When confronted with videos of his victims, Vance's response was clinical. Each injury, each death provides data points: emotional responses to violence, escalation patterns, intervention effects. This information is invaluable. It was Hector who pointed out the fundamental flaw in Vance's logic during one discussion. He talks about preventing future conflicts, but he was creating conflicts that wouldn't have existed without his intervention. He wasn't studying natural human behavior, he was manufacturing it. The investigation continued for weeks, as authorities unraveled the full extent of Vance's network. His funding sources were traced to a disturbing array of actors: a Russian oligarch interested in American social instability, a Chinese company ostensibly studying crowd control, several extremist groups hoping to spark racial conflicts, and even some legitimate research institutions that had no idea their grants were being used for such purposes. The victims, those who had survived the orchestrated conflicts, faced their own challenges. Many were undocumented immigrants afraid to cooperate with authorities. Others were homeless individuals with mental health issues that made their testimony unreliable. Some simply wanted to forget and move on, unable to process that their suffering had been deliberately orchestrated for someone's research. Clara found herself particularly troubled by one victim she interviewed, a man named Carlos, who had been in the Salt River camp. "I thought I knew who my enemies were," he told her. "Other homeless folks trying to steal my stuff, cops trying to move us along. But to find out someone was making us fight each other for science, how do you trust anyone after that?" His question haunted Clara. Vance's experiments had not just caused physical violence. They had shattered the fragile trust that existed in communities already struggling with poverty and marginalization. The social fabric of these vulnerable populations had been deliberately torn, and repairing it would take far longer than treating the physical wounds. As the formal investigation wound down, Clara returned to Cochise County, where Sheriff Mason welcomed her back with a mixture of pride and concern. "You did outstanding work, Sandoval, but I can see this case has taken its toll." He wasn't wrong. Clara found herself constantly suspicious of conflicts she encountered, wondering if they were organic or orchestrated. Every homeless camp she passed, every group of day laborers, every gathering of society's marginalized, made her wonder if someone was watching, manipulating, documenting. One evening, 3 months after Vance's arrest, Clara and Hector met at a small bar in Bisbee. The trial was approaching, and they would both have to testify. But that night, they just wanted to process everything they had experienced. "Do you think Vance was right about one thing?" Hector asked after a long silence. "That understanding conflict dynamics could prevent future violence?" Clara considered the question carefully. "Maybe, but not like this. You can't understand human behavior by forcing it into artificial patterns. Vance wasn't studying conflict. He was creating it. Real prevention comes from addressing the conditions that make people vulnerable to manipulation. Poverty, desperation, lack of resources." Hector nodded. "The saddest part is that all those people, the homeless, the migrants, they were already struggling. Vance just weaponized their struggles." As they talked, Clara's phone buzzed with a news alert. There had been a fight at a homeless camp in Tucson. Her first instinct was to wonder if it was connected to Vance somehow, if they had missed some part of his network. But then she forced herself to stop. Not every conflict was orchestrated. Sometimes, desperate people in difficult situations came into conflict naturally. The trial of Marcus Vance and his accomplices became a sensation, though the full details were kept from the public to prevent copycat incidents. Vance was eventually convicted on multiple charges including conspiracy, incitement to violence, and murder, receiving a life sentence without possibility of parole. His research, all those terabytes of data derived from human suffering, was sealed by court order, deemed too dangerous to ever be released. During his sentencing, Vance made a final statement that sent chills through the courtroom. "You can imprison me, but you can't imprison ideas. Others will continue this work. The need to understand human conflict is too important. Someone will pick up where I left off, and they'll be smarter, more careful. The experiment will continue." Clara wanted to dismiss this as the ravings of a delusional man, but she knew there was a kernel of truth in his words. The techniques Vance had developed, the methodology of orchestrating conflict among vulnerable populations, was now known. Despite efforts to suppress the information, details had leaked. Somewhere, someone might be planning similar experiments. In the aftermath of the case, Clara found herself changed. She had always known that evil existed, but Vance had shown her a particularly insidious form of it. Evil dressed up as science. Cruelty justified by data. Suffering transformed into spreadsheets and statistics. It was a reminder that the most dangerous people weren't always the ones with guns or drugs, but sometimes those with clipboards and cameras, watching from the shadows and taking notes while others bled. The abandoned properties around Cochise County were gradually cleaned up, some demolished, others renovated for legitimate uses. But Clara could never pass one without remembering what had happened there. How desperation had been transformed into data points in a madman's research. 1 year after Vance's arrest, Clara received a package with no return address. Inside was a flash drive and a note in Anna's handwriting. "They're starting again. Different cities, different methods, but the same idea. Be ready." Clara stared at the flash drive, knowing that opening it would mean starting down another dark path. But she also knew she couldn't ignore it. Vance had been right about one thing. The experiment would continue. And as long as it did, people like Clara would have to be ready to stop it. She inserted the flash drive into her computer, watching as files began to appear. Maps of new cities, lists of vulnerable populations, analysis of conflict potential. The methodology was different, more subtle than Vance's approach, but the core concept remained: turning human misery into data, orchestrating suffering for study. Clara picked up her phone and called Agent Park. "We have a problem," she said when he answered. "It's happening again." As she began to explain what she had found, Clara realized that her fight against those who would exploit society's most vulnerable was far from over. Vance had been stopped, but he had also been a proof of concept. Others had seen what was possible and were refining the approach. The night patrol that had started with strange lights and sounds at an abandoned ranch had led to something much larger, an ongoing battle against those who saw human suffering not as a tragedy to be prevented, but as a resource to be exploited. And Clara knew that as long as such people existed, her work would never truly be done. Outside her window, the desert stretched endlessly under the starlit sky. Somewhere out there, in abandoned buildings and forgotten corners, vulnerable people gathered seeking shelter and community. And somewhere else, predators watched and planned, seeing not human beings but subjects for their twisted experiments. Clara closed the files and prepared to begin again. The night patrol continued, not just through the physical darkness of the desert, but through the moral darkness of those who would turn poverty into a laboratory and desperation into data. She had chosen this path, to stand between the vulnerable and those who would exploit them. And despite the toll it took, despite the horrors she had witnessed, she would continue. Because if Vance's experiments had taught her anything, it was that evil flourished when good people looked away. And Clara Sandoval would never look away again. A monotonous silence reigned in the dispatch center of the Santa Cruz County Sheriff's Department. This was broken at 2:47 a.m. by the crackling sound of the radio. Teresa Quintero was working her third night shift. When she reached for her coffee cup, she found it empty. Despite having worked as a dispatch officer for 8 years, the night shifts at the Arizona-Mexico border were still as challenging as they had been in the early days. Only the environment she found herself in had become more familiar. "Unit 7, this is dispatch," she spoke into her headset, recognizing Sheriff Vicente Navarro's call sign before he even identified himself. After 5 years of working together, she knew the subtle patterns of his radio protocol, the way he paused before transmitting, the particular static signature of his vehicle's radio. "Dispatch, Unit 7. I'm approximately 12 miles south of Arivaca on Ruby Road, following up on that reported suspicious vehicle from earlier. No visual yet, but I'm approaching the coordinates the rancher provided." Teresa pulled up the incident report on her screen. A local rancher named Dale Morrison had called in around midnight, reporting a white van parked on a dirt road that bordered his property. Morrison said the vehicle had been there since at least sunset, hadn't moved, and appeared abandoned. In this part of Arizona, 30 miles from the Mexican border, abandoned vehicles often meant one of 3 things: mechanical failure, drug smuggling, or human trafficking. Sometimes all 3. "Copy that, Unit 7. Be advised, backup is approximately 45 minutes out if needed. Deputy Rodriguez is handling a domestic in Tubac." "Understood," Navarro replied, his voice carrying that particular mix of weariness and alertness that came from too many years patrolling these borderlands alone. Vicente Navarro had been sheriff of Santa Cruz County for 6 years, and at 48 he'd spent more than half his life in law enforcement. He'd started as a border patrol agent, switched to county law enforcement for better hours and the illusion of safer work, only to find himself still patrolling the same dangerous stretches of desert, just with different paperwork. The dirt road was barely visible in the darkness, marked only by the slightly different texture of packed earth against the surrounding desert. His headlights swept across Ocotillo and Palo Verde trees, their shadows creating dancing patterns that could hide anything or nothing. The GPS on his dashboard showed he was getting close to Morrison's reported location, a stretch of unnamed road that appeared on no official maps, but was well known to locals, smugglers, and law enforcement alike. Then he saw it. A white Ford Transit van, sitting at an odd angle about 50 yards off the road, partially hidden behind a cluster of mesquite trees. The positioning was deliberate, meant to conceal the vehicle from casual observation, but not quite hidden enough to be completely invisible. This was either amateur work or someone wanted it to be found eventually. "Dispatch, I have visual on the vehicle," Navarro reported, already running the plates through his mobile terminal. "White Ford Transit, Arizona plates." He squinted through his binoculars. "Kilo Romeo 74391. Teresa's fingers flew across her keyboard. "Unit 7, plates come back to a rental company in Phoenix. Rented 5 days ago to Michael Thompson. Address listed as a hotel in Phoenix. Running Thompson now." While she searched, Navarro approached the van cautiously, his hand resting on his service weapon but not drawing it. 23 years of experience had taught him to be prepared for anything, but not to escalate unnecessarily. The van's windows were tinted, making it impossible to see inside from a distance. No light emanated from within, no sounds of movement or running engine. Michael Thompson shows a suspended license, one prior for possession. Nothing violent, Teresa reported. "But Sheriff, that name's been flagged by DEA. Possible alias used in 3 previous smuggling investigations." Navarro felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came with potentially dangerous situations when backup was too far away to matter. He keyed his shoulder mic. "Copy that. I'm going to approach and check the vehicle. Keep the channel clear." The desert silence was absolute, except for his footsteps on the gravelly soil and the distant call of a great horned owl. As he got closer, he could see that the van's driver's side door was slightly ajar, the dome light off despite the door being open. That meant either the battery was dead or someone had deliberately disabled the interior lights, a common smuggler's modification. "Sheriff's Department," Navarro announced loudly, his voice carrying across the empty desert. "Anyone in the vehicle, make yourself known." Silence. He approached the driver's door, flashlight in his left hand, right hand still on his weapon. Through the gap in the door, he could see the driver's seat was empty. Dark stains on the fabric caught his attention immediately. Blood, dried but not ancient, maybe a day or 2 old. Not enough for a fatal wound, but significant enough to suggest serious injury. Navarro pulled the door fully open, the hinges creaking in protest. The smell hit him immediately. Blood, sweat, fear, and something else. Something chemical and sharp. The dashboard had been torn apart, wires hanging loose where electronics had been hastily removed. The police radio mount was empty, but marks in the dust showed something had been there recently. "Dispatch, vehicle is abandoned. Signs of blood in the driver's area. Dashboard has been stripped. Checking the cargo area now." "Copy that, Unit 7. Want me to notify Border Patrol?" "Not yet. Let me finish my initial assessment." The cargo area of the van told a more complete story. Dozens of water jugs, some full, some empty. Backpacks arranged in rows, each one identical, the kind bought in bulk. Blankets, food supplies, and most tellingly a set of fraudulent documents scattered across the floor. Fake Social Security cards, driver's licenses, work permits. But these weren't high-quality forgeries. They were rush jobs, the kind made when plans had gone wrong and people needed documentation quickly. Navarro photographed everything methodically, his flashlight beam revealing more disturbing details. More blood, this time on the cargo door handle and floor. Drag marks in the dust leading from the van toward the desert. And there, caught on a sharp edge of metal, a torn piece of fabric that looked like it came from a uniform. Not military, but similar. Private security, maybe, or one of the militia groups that sometimes patrolled these areas illegally. "Teresa, I'm going to need a full forensics team out here at sunrise," he said into his radio. "And contact Border Patrol and DEA. This is definitely smuggling related, but something went wrong." Understood, Sheriff. Weather Service is showing a storm system moving in from the Gulf. Expected to hit your area around dawn. You want to wait for backup before investigating further? Navarro looked at the drag marks leading into the desert. If there were injured people out there, waiting until dawn might be too late. But following potential smugglers into the desert alone at night was exactly the kind of decision that got law enforcement officers killed in these borderlands. I'm going to follow the trail a short distance, see if there's anyone who needs immediate medical attention, he decided. Keep the channel open. If I don't check in every 10 minutes, send everything you've got. Vicente, please be careful, Teresa said, dropping protocol and using his first name. They'd known each other too long for her to hide her concern. He followed the drag marks by flashlight, his boots crunching on the desert floor. The trail led through a gap in a barbed wire fence that marked the edge of Morrison's ranch and into federal land. About 100 yards from the van, he found the first grave. It was shallow, hastily dug, the disturbed earth obvious even in the darkness. A boot protruded from one end, and the smell of decomposition, while faint, was unmistakable. Navarro photographed the site without disturbing it, then noticed something that made his blood chill. There were more disturbed areas nearby. 3, 4, maybe 5 similar patches of recently moved earth. Dispatch, I've found what appears to be multiple burial sites, shallow graves recently dug. We're looking at a major crime scene here. Before Teresa could respond, Navarro heard something that made him freeze. Voices carried on the night wind, speaking Spanish. They were some distance away, but getting closer. He clicked off his flashlight and moved behind a large saguaro cactus, drawing his weapon for the first time. The voices grew clearer. At least 3 men, maybe more. They were arguing about something, their tones aggressive and stressed. Navarro's Spanish was fluent, a necessity in this region, and what he heard made the situation even more concerning. Told you we should have burned the van. The sheriff will find them eventually. Doesn't matter. We'll be across by then. What about the American? He knows too much. They were maybe 50 yards away now, moving through the desert with the confidence of people who knew the terrain well. Navarro was outnumbered, in the dark, with backup still at least 30 minutes away. He keyed his radio as quietly as possible. Multiple subjects approaching my position, at least 3 possibly armed, requesting immediate backup. All units are responding, Sheriff. ETA 25 minutes for the closest unit. 25 minutes might as well have been 25 hours. The men were getting closer, and from their conversation, it was clear they were returning to either clean up the scene or finish whatever had been started. Navarro had 2 options: retreat to his vehicle and wait for backup, potentially losing valuable evidence and possibly witnesses, or stay hidden and gather intelligence. A third option presented itself when one of the men said, "Check the van first. Make sure we didn't leave anything that could identify the operation." They were splitting up. This was both an opportunity and a danger. Navarro could potentially isolate and apprehend one suspect, but it also meant threats from multiple directions. He made his decision quickly, moving silently back toward the van, hoping to position himself to intercept whoever was sent to check it. He had barely taken position behind a cluster of rocks near the van when a figure emerged from the darkness. Young, maybe mid-20s, wearing military-style tactical gear, but carrying himself like someone playing soldier rather than actual military. The assault rifle in his hands, however, was very real. The man approached the van cautiously, clearly nervous. He was alone, the others having continued toward the burial sites. This was Navarro's best chance, possibly his only chance. He waited until the man was examining the van's interior, his weapon lowered and attention focused on searching for something specific. "Sheriff's Department, drop your weapon and show your hands." The man spun around, raising his rifle instinctively. Navarro had a split second to make a decision that would be scrutinized by review boards and lawyers for months to come. The muzzle of the rifle swung toward him, and training took over. 2 shots, center mass. The man crumpled, his rifle clattering on the rocks. The sound of gunfire in the desert night was like thunder, echoing off the distant mountains. Immediately, shouts erupted from the direction of the burial sites. Navarro grabbed the fallen man's rifle and took cover behind the van, knowing he had seconds before the others arrived. "Shots fired. Officer needs assistance," he called into his radio, no longer concerned about noise discipline. "All units expediting. Vicente, what's your status?" Teresa's voice was tight with controlled panic. "One suspect down, multiple armed subjects approaching. I'm taking cover behind the van." The first shots came from his left, muzzle flashes in the darkness followed by the distinctive crack of bullets passing nearby. Navarro returned fire in controlled bursts, trying to suppress rather than hit targets he couldn't clearly see. His ammunition was limited, 2 magazines for his service weapon, plus whatever was in the rifle he'd recovered. The radio chatter intensified as units across the county responded, but Navarro could barely hear it over the sound of gunfire. The suspects had spread out, trying to flank his position. He moved constantly, using the van as mobile cover, but he knew it was only a matter of time before they surrounded him completely. Then, suddenly, the shooting stopped. The desert returned to silence except for the ringing in Navarro's ears. He stayed low, scanning for movement, wondering if they were repositioning or if something else had happened. A voice called out in accented English. "Sheriff, we don't want to kill a cop. This isn't about you. Just let us leave and everyone lives." "You know I can't do that," Navarro responded, trying to pinpoint the speaker's location. "Throw down your weapons and surrender. Backup is already en route." 5 minutes away, Vicente," Teresa whispered in his earpiece. "Border Patrol has a helicopter inbound too, ETA 8 minutes. 5 minutes. He just had to survive 5 more minutes." But then he heard something that changed everything. A woman's scream, coming from the direction of the burial sites. It was muffled, as if someone was trying to keep her quiet, but the terror in it was unmistakable. "You hear that, Sheriff?" the voice called out again. "We found something you missed. Pretty young thing was hiding in a hole out here. Now, you can keep playing hero, or you can let us go and we leave her here alive. Your choice." Navarro's mind raced. If there was a survivor, someone who had hidden from whatever violence had occurred here, he couldn't let her become another casualty. But he also knew that surrendering his position would likely mean his own death and the loss of any witnesses. "Prove she's alive," he called back, buying time. There was commotion in the darkness, then a young woman's voice speaking rapid Spanish begging for help. She sounded terrified but uninjured. Navarro made one of the hardest decisions of his career. "All right," he called out. "Here's the deal. You release the woman, let her walk to me, and you can leave. But you go on foot, leave your weapons." Laughter echoed across the desert. "You think we're stupid, Sheriff? No deal. You put down your weapons and walk away from the van. We take it and leave. The girl stays alive." 3 minutes, Vicente," Teresa updated him. "Whatever you're going to do." Before he could respond, headlights appeared in the distance, approaching fast on the dirt road. But something was wrong. The lights were coming from the wrong direction, from the south toward Mexico, not from the north where backup would approach. "Shit," the voice in the darkness cursed. "It's them. Sheriff, you need to run, now." The fear in the smuggler's voice was genuine and immediate. Whatever was approaching scared them more than the law enforcement did. Navarro heard them scrambling in the darkness. No longer concerned with him, their attention entirely on the approaching vehicles. 3 trucks crested the small rise, their headlights illuminating the entire scene like daylight. Navarro could see his attackers now. 4 men in tactical gear, abandoning their positions and running toward the desert. He also saw the woman they had mentioned. A young girl, really, maybe 18, crawling out from behind a rock formation. The truck stopped in a semicircle, and men poured out, at least a dozen, all armed with military-grade weapons. But these weren't cartel soldiers or smugglers. Their movements were too professional, too coordinated. They wore matching black tactical gear with no insignia, and they moved with the precision of trained military operators. "Sheriff Navarro," a voice called out from behind the blinding headlights. American accent, neutral, could have been from anywhere. "Please remain where you are. We're here to clean up this mess." "Identify yourself," Navarro demanded, though he kept his weapon lowered. These men, whoever they were, could have killed him already if that was their intent. A figure stepped forward, silhouetted against the headlights. "Let's just say we're concerned citizens who don't appreciate certain activities taking place so close to our border. The men who are shooting at you are part of a group that's been causing problems for everyone, law enforcement and legitimate businessmen alike." "Vicente, I've got units 30 seconds out," Teresa said in his ear. Multiple agencies responding. But even as she said it, Navarro could hear the distant sound of helicopters, more than one approaching from the south. The man in black seemed to hear them too. "Sheriff, in about 60 seconds, this place is going to be very crowded. You're going to want to focus on the van, the graves, and that young lady over there who I'm sure has quite a story to tell. You won't find us or the men who were shooting at you. But I can tell you this. Check the 3rd grave carefully. What you find there will explain everything." The men in black were already moving back to their vehicles with the same precision they'd shown arriving. Within seconds, they were driving away, lights off now, disappearing into the desert as sirens became audible in the distance. Navarro rushed to the young woman who was huddled against a rock, shaking with fear and cold. She was Hispanic, wearing torn clothes that had once been a waitress uniform from a restaurant Navarro recognized in Nogales. "You're safe now," he told her in Spanish, wrapping his jacket around her shoulders. "What's your name?" "Rosa," she whispered. "Rosa Martinez. They killed everyone else. I hid when the shooting started. I've been hiding for 2 days." "Who killed everyone? The men who were just here?" She shook her head. "No, others, Americans. They said they were police, but they weren't. They executed everyone. Miguel, Ana, Jorge, all of them. Said we saw something we shouldn't have. Dawn brought a crime scene that would haunt everyone who worked it. As the sun painted the desert in shades of orange and pink, revealing the full scope of what had occurred, even veteran investigators found themselves overwhelmed. The FBI had taken over the scene, given the international implications and the scale of the crime. But Navarro remained involved as the initial responding officer and the highest-ranking local law enforcement present. Special Agent Diana Foster, leading the FBI team, stood with Navarro at the edge of what they now knew were 7 shallow graves. The forensic team had worked through the night, carefully excavating each burial site. The victims were a mix of Mexican nationals and Americans, all showing signs of execution-style killings except for one. "The 3rd grave, just like your mysterious friend suggested," Foster said, gesturing to where technicians were photographing the most unusual discovery. James Mitchell, age 44, former DEA agent who supposedly died in a car accident 3 years ago. Navarro studied the body, which was notably fresher than Mitchell's supposed death date would suggest. He's only been dead maybe 3 days, so either someone faked his death 3 years ago, or there's a much bigger game being played here, Foster finished. Mitchell was investigating corruption within border enforcement agencies when he died. His accident was suspicious, but the case was closed quickly. Too quickly, according to some. Teresa's voice crackled through Navarro's radio. "Sheriff, I'm patching through a call from the hospital. It's about the survivor." Rosa Martinez had been transported to the medical center in Nogales for treatment and observation. She was dehydrated and traumatized, but physically unharmed. What she had told investigators during her initial interview had already sent shockwaves through multiple agencies. According to Rosa, she had been working at a restaurant in Nogales when she was approached by a man offering her work as a translator for what he claimed was a legitimate transport company. The pay was too good to refuse. $500 a day to ride along with shipments and translate for drivers who didn't speak English. She thought she would be translating for truck drivers hauling produce or manufactured goods. Instead, she found herself in a van with 7 other people, being driven into the desert by men with guns. But they weren't typical human traffickers. They wore uniforms that looked official, had badges, and spoke like law enforcement. The other passengers seemed to be a mix of people who had been similarly deceived and some who appeared to be willing participants in something larger. They kept talking about the exchange, Rosa had told investigators. Something about trading intelligence for safe passage. One of the Americans, the older man you found in the 3rd grave, he kept saying he had proof of something, that people needed to know the truth. That older man was James Mitchell, and what he had been trying to reveal was becoming clearer as the FBI cyber team worked on a damaged laptop found buried with him. The device had been wrapped in plastic, protected from the elements, almost as if Mitchell had known he might not survive and wanted to preserve the evidence he'd gathered. "Sheriff," Agent Foster called from the mobile command unit they'd established. "You need to see this." On the laptop screen were dozens of files. Financial records, photographs, recorded conversations. Mitchell had spent his supposed death investigating a network of corrupt officials on both sides of the border who were facilitating not just drug smuggling but something more sinister, the trafficking of intelligence and weapons to unknown buyers. "Look at this." Foster pointed to a spreadsheet. Border Patrol schedules, DEA operation plans, even FBI surveillance details. Someone was selling our operational intelligence to the cartels, but that's not the worst part. She opened another file, this one containing satellite imagery and technical specifications. These are classified military documents, patrol routes for military assets along the border, response protocols for terrorist threats, even nuclear detection equipment locations. This goes way beyond simple corruption. Navarro felt a chill despite the rising desert heat. Who was Mitchell planning to give this to? According to his notes, he had arranged a meeting with a journalist from the Washington Post. But someone found out. The massacre here was about stopping that information from getting out. The young woman's survival suddenly made more sense. She had been an unintended witness, someone who wasn't supposed to be there. The killers had eliminated everyone who knew about Mitchell's evidence but had somehow missed Rosa hiding in the darkness. As the day progressed, more pieces of the puzzle emerged. The van's stripped dashboard had contained sophisticated communication equipment capable of intercepting and decoding encrypted law enforcement channels. The fake documents weren't for smuggling immigrants, but for creating clean identities for intelligence assets. The water and supplies were props, camouflage for the real operation. "We've identified 2 more bodies," a forensic technician reported to Foster and Navarro. Marcus Rodriguez, former Army intelligence discharged in 2018, and Sarah Kim, a contractor who worked for a private security firm that had government contracts. Each victim, it seemed, had been part of Mitchell's network of informants, or had stumbled onto the operation accidentally. The execution-style killing suggested professional work, not cartel violence. Someone with training and resources had eliminated these people to protect the larger conspiracy. Navarro's phone rang. It was Sheriff Mason from Cochise County, a colleague he'd known for years. "Vicente, you need to be very careful. I just got a visit from some federal types asking about your investigation. They weren't FBI or DEA. When I asked for credentials, they left. Something's not right." Before Navarro could respond, he noticed several black SUVs approaching the crime scene on the dirt road. They bore no agency markings, and the men who emerged wore suits despite the desert heat. One of them, a tall man with prematurely gray hair, walked directly toward Foster and Navarro. "Agent Foster, Sheriff Navarro," he said, producing credentials that identified him as Deputy Director Harold Morrison from the Department of Homeland Security. "I'm afraid this investigation is now under federal jurisdiction. We'll need all evidence and documentation transferred to our team immediately." Foster bristled. "This is an active FBI crime scene. You can't just—" "I can and I am," Morrison interrupted, handing her a document. "This is a national security matter now. Your involvement ends here." Navarro read the document over Foster's shoulder. It was legitimate, signed by people so high up the chain of command that arguing would be career suicide. But something about Morrison's urgency suggested this was less about investigating the crime and more about controlling the narrative. "What about the survivor?" Navarro asked. "Rosa Martinez?" Morrison's expression didn't change. "She'll be transferred to federal protective custody for her safety. We'll handle her debriefing from here. I'd like to maintain local jurisdiction involvement," Navarro pressed. "This happened in my county." "Your request is noted and denied," Morrison said flatly. "Sheriff, you did excellent work here, but this is beyond local law enforcement now. For your own safety and career, I suggest you file your report and move on." The threat was subtle but clear. Navarro watched as federal agents began dismantling the FBI's crime scene operation, loading evidence into their vehicles with an efficiency that suggested they'd done this before. Foster looked furious but helpless. As the federal takeover proceeded, Navarro noticed one of the forensic technicians, a young woman named Julie Smith, quietly slip him a flash drive while pretending to return his evidence bags. "Copies of everything," she whispered. "Something's not right here." Within an hour, the crime scene was cleared, the evidence removed, and the federal agents gone. The desert returned to its normal quiet, as if the violence and revelations of the past 24 hours had never occurred. But Navarro had the flash drive, and he knew Rosa Martinez was still at the hospital, at least for now. "Teresa," he called on a private channel as he drove back toward town. "I need you to do something off the books. Can you access the hospital's patient database?" "Vicente, what are you planning?" "Those federal agents are going to make Rosa disappear, probably claim she was never here. We need to document everything before that happens." There was a pause before Teresa responded. "She's still there, room 314. But Vicente, there are 2 men in suits sitting outside her door. They're not regular hospital security." Navarro made a decision that would define the rest of his career and possibly his life. He turned his vehicle toward the hospital, knowing he was about to cross lines that couldn't be uncrossed. But Mitchell had died trying to expose something. 7 other people had been murdered to keep it secret, and Rosa Martinez was the only witness left who could tell the truth. The hospital parking lot was busy with morning shift changes, providing good cover as Navarro entered through the emergency department. He knew the layout well from years of interviewing victims and suspects here. Room 314 was on the 3rd floor, in the section reserved for patients requiring security or protection. He took the stairs, avoiding the main elevators where he might be seen by the federal agents. On the 3rd floor, he peered through the door window. Two men in dark suits sat in chairs outside Rosa's room, one reading a tablet, the other on his phone. They looked bored, complacent, not expecting trouble. Navarro pulled out his phone and called Teresa. "I need you to call the hospital and report a disturbance in the emergency department. Something that would require security response. Vicente, this is—" "I know what it is. Will you do it?" "Of course. Be careful." Within minutes, Navarro heard the hospital intercom calling for security to respond to the emergency department. The two agents looked at each other, debating. Finally, one stood and walked toward the elevators, probably to check if the disturbance was related to their mission. Navarro waited until the man was gone, then walked confidently down the hallway, his sheriff's uniform and badge giving him apparent legitimacy. The remaining agent looked up from his phone. "Sheriff Navarro," the agent said, recognizing him from the crime scene. "You're not supposed to be here." "Just need 5 minutes with the witness," Navarro said calmly. "Final questions for my report. No one sees her without Director Morrison's approval." Navarro nodded, as if accepting this, then suddenly grabbed the agent's phone and shoved him backward. The man, caught off guard, stumbled over his chair. Navarro was through the door before the agent could recover. Rosa was awake, sitting up in bed, her eyes widening in fear, then recognition. "Sheriff?" "Rosa, I don't have much time. These men are going to take you somewhere, and you might not get a chance to tell your story. I need you to tell me everything quickly." Behind him, he could hear the agent calling for backup. They had maybe 2 minutes before the room flooded with federal agents. Rosa spoke rapidly in Spanish, her words tumbling out. "The American, Mitchell, he talked to me before they killed him. He said the corruption goes all the way to Washington. People in Homeland Security, CIA, even Congress. They're selling secrets to anyone who pays. Cartels, foreign governments, terrorists." He had proof on his computer. "Did he say who specifically?" "Morrison. He mentioned that name. Said Morrison was the cleanup man, the one who makes problems disappear. And there's something else. Mitchell said there's a place in the desert, an old military installation that's supposed to be abandoned. Grid reference." She closed her eyes, trying to remember. 77 November 45 West. He said that's where they coordinate everything. The door burst open. The agent Navarro had pushed entered with his weapon drawn, followed by his partner and hospital security. "Step away from the witness, Sheriff." Navarro raised his hand slowly, his phone in one hand still recording. "Just finishing my interview. You're under arrest for interfering with a federal investigation and assaulting a federal agent." As they cuffed him, Navarro made eye contact with Rosa one last time. She nodded slightly, understanding that he had heard her, that someone would remember her story even if she disappeared. But as they led him from the room, Navarro saw something that gave him hope. In the hallway, mixed in with the gathering crowd of hospital staff and patients, was a familiar face. Diana Foster, the FBI agent, holding up her phone, recording everything. She had come to the same conclusion he had, that something was deeply wrong with this federal takeover. Their eyes met briefly, and Foster mouthed a single word: "Later." Navarro spent 6 hours in federal custody before being released without charges, a development that surprised him more than his arrest. Deputy Director Morrison personally handled his release, meeting him in a stark interview room at the federal building in Tucson. "Sheriff Navarro," Morrison began, his tone conversational rather than confrontational. "You're a good cop, 23 years of exemplary service, commendations for bravery, respected by your community. Why throw all that away?" "I could ask you the same question," Navarro replied. "How long have you been covering up murders to protect your operation?" Morrison's expression didn't change. You've misunderstood the situation. What Mitchell thought he discovered, what that girl thinks she knows, it's all fragments of something much more complex. Yes, there are operations along the border that require secrecy. Yes, sometimes those operations involve working with unsavory individuals, but it's all in service of national security. Selling classified information to cartels is national security? Controlling the flow of information, managing chaos rather than letting it run wild. Sometimes that requires difficult choices. Morrison leaned back in his chair. Sheriff, you've worked this border long enough to know it's not black and white. Sometimes we have to work with bad people to stop worse ones. And Mitchell? The 7 other people in those graves? Morrison's jaw tightened slightly, the first sign of emotion he'd shown. Mitchell was a crusader who didn't understand the bigger picture. His investigation would have exposed operations that have prevented terrorist attacks, stopped weapons of mass destruction from entering the country, saved thousands of lives. Yes, his death was regrettable, but it was necessary. You're admitting to murder? I'm admitting nothing. Mitchell died in a car accident 3 years ago. The body you found was someone else, a smuggler who happened to have similar physical characteristics. The DNA tests will confirm this. Navarro understood the threat implicit in Morrison's words. The evidence would be whatever Morrison decided it would be. But he also had cards to play. Rosa Martinez recorded her entire experience. She uploaded it to the cloud before your men picked her up. If anything happens to her or me, that recording goes public. Morrison smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Miss Martinez is in protective custody for her own safety. She witnessed a cartel execution and her life is in danger. We're relocating her with a new identity, a generous resettlement package, and the chance for a new life. Isn't that what's best for her? If she agrees to forget what she saw. If she agrees to accept the truth of what she saw, a cartel hit that eliminated smugglers and unfortunate bystanders. You found evidence of human trafficking, which you heroically interrupted. There will even be a commendation in it for you, Sheriff. Maybe a federal task force position if you're interested. The offer was clear. Play along and be rewarded, or resist and face the consequences. Navarro had seen this game before, though never at this level. I need to think about it, he said finally. Morrison stood. You have 24 hours. After that, well, the desert is a dangerous place. Deputies sometimes don't come home from patrol. Accidents happen. After his release, Navarro drove aimlessly for an hour, checking for surveillance, before pulling into a truck stop near Sonoita. He was unsurprised when Diana Foster appeared at his table 10 minutes later, sliding into the booth across from him. Interesting day, she said quietly. You could say that. Coffee? They ordered, making small talk until the waitress was gone. Then Foster leaned forward. I've been investigating Morrison and his network for 2 years. Mitchell was my informant. Navarro wasn't entirely surprised. FBI Internal Affairs? Something like that. There's a joint task force, very small, very secret, investigating corruption at the highest levels of border security. Morrison is just middle management in something much bigger. She pulled out a tablet, showing him a complex organizational chart. This is what we've mapped so far. It includes officials from Homeland Security, CIA, DEA, Border Patrol, and at least 3 members of Congress. They call themselves the Line, as in holding the line against chaos. They believe the official government is too constrained by laws and oversight to effectively protect the country. So they created their own shadow operation. Exactly. They facilitate certain smuggling operations to maintain control over the criminal networks. They sell intelligence to cartels to keep them fighting each other rather than uniting. They eliminate threats to their operation, whether those threats are criminals, terrorists, or federal agents who get too close to the truth. Navarro studied the chart, recognizing several names, people he'd worked with or reported to over the years. How deep does this go? We don't know. Mitchell was close to finding out when they discovered him. The massacre at the border was about eliminating him and anyone he might have told about his investigation. What about Rosa Martinez? Foster's expression darkened. She's the key. She's the only surviving witness to the execution, the only one who can testify that it wasn't a cartel hit. But Morrison has her, and we can't get a warrant without revealing our investigation. Navarro pulled out the flash drive Julie Smith had given him. The forensic technician made copies of everything before Morrison's team seized it. Foster's eyes widened. That could be enough to get federal warrants to bring this whole thing down. But we need Rosa's testimony to make it stick. Morrison gave me 24 hours to decide whether to play along. He doesn't know you're investigating him? As far as he knows, I'm just an FBI agent who got pulled off an interesting case. But Vicente, if you cross him, he will kill you. He's done it before. Navarro thought about his 23 years in law enforcement, about the oath he'd taken, about the bodies in those shallow graves. Then we have 24 hours to find Rosa and bring down the line. They spent the next hours planning. Foster would use the flash drive evidence to expedite federal warrants while maintaining the appearance of accepting the case reassignment. Navarro would pretend to agree to Morrison's terms while trying to locate Rosa. Teresa proved instrumental in the search. Using her access to various law enforcement databases, she tracked the federal vehicles that had transported Rosa from the hospital. They had driven north toward Phoenix, but then disappeared from traffic cameras near an Air Force base. They're probably holding her at a federal safe house, Foster said, studying the map. Morrison has access to several in Arizona, black sites used for witness protection or interrogation. How do we find the right one? We don't. We make Morrison bring her to us. The plan Foster proposed was dangerous but clever. Navarro would agree to Morrison's terms but insist on personally delivering Rosa to her new identity placement, claiming he needed to ensure her safety for his own conscience. Morrison, believing he had won, might agree to maintain Navarro's cooperation. That evening, Navarro called Morrison. "I'm in, but I have conditions." "You're hardly in a position to make demands, Sheriff. I need to know Rosa is safe. I need to see her relocated personally. You do that, and I'll not only stay quiet, I'll actively support your narrative. I'll even help identify others who might be problems for you." There was a long pause. "You're asking to be brought deeper into the operation." "I'm being pragmatic. You're right about the border. Sometimes we need to make hard choices, but I need to know the people under my protection are safe." "Very well. Tomorrow morning, 6 a.m., the abandoned Rocking K Ranch off Highway 82. Come alone. You'll escort Miss Martinez to her relocation point. After that, you're one of us." After the call, Navarro contacted Foster. "It's set. Rocking K Ranch, 6 a.m. That's 40 miles from any backup. If this goes wrong, then you'll have what you need on that flash drive to finish this without me." They refined their plan through the night. Foster would position FBI tactical teams just outside the area, ready to move in when Rosa was confirmed present. The goal was to extract Rosa and arrest Morrison simultaneously, but everyone knew the chances of everything going smoothly were slim. At 5:30 a.m., Navarro drove toward the Rocking K Ranch, the sunrise painting the mountains blood red. The abandoned ranch had been a crime scene before, a place where drug deals went bad and bodies were occasionally found. It was isolated enough that gunfire wouldn't attract attention and close enough to Mexico that bodies could disappear across the border. He arrived to find 3 black SUVs already there. Morrison standing beside one with two other men. There was no sign of Rosa. "Sheriff," Morrison greeted him. "Glad you could make it. Miss Martinez is in the vehicle. We'll transport her together to the relocation site. I want to see her first." Morrison nodded to one of his men, who opened the rear door of the middle SUV. Rosa was inside, zip-tied and gagged, her eyes wide with fear. She was alive, but clearly a prisoner, not a protected witness. "Zip ties seem excessive for witness protection," Navarro observed. "She's been uncooperative, keeps insisting on telling her story to media outlets. We can't have that." Morrison's tone was casual, as if discussing a minor inconvenience. "Once she's relocated, she'll understand it's for her own good." Navarro knew this was the moment. Rosa was here. Morrison had essentially admitted to holding her against her will, and the FBI teams were in position. But something felt wrong. Morrison was too calm, too confident. "Before we go," Morrison said, "I need you to do something to prove your commitment." He handed Navarro a pistol. "There's a problem that needs solving, a loose end from the border incident." One of Morrison's men opened the back of the third SUV, revealing a bound figure. Navarro's heart sank as he recognized Julie Smith, the forensic technician who had given him the flash drive. "She made unauthorized copies of evidence," Morrison explained. "That's a federal crime, of course, but more importantly, it shows she can't be trusted. You're going to solve this problem for us." Navarro understood now. This wasn't about bringing him into the organization. This was about compromising him, making him complicit in murder so he could never testify against them. Morrison knew about the flash drive, probably knew about Foster's investigation, and was tying up loose ends. "I'm not killing anyone," Navarro said firmly. "Then both women die, and you have an unfortunate accident on the way back to town. Your choice, Sheriff. One death or three." Navarro looked at the pistol in his hand, then at Morrison. "You're right, there is a problem that needs solving." He raised the weapon, but instead of pointing it at Smith, he aimed at Morrison. "Federal agents, nobody move." The desert erupted in chaos. FBI vehicles that had been hidden behind rises and in arroyos suddenly appeared, agents in tactical gear swarming the scene. Morrison's men reached for weapons but were overwhelmed by superior numbers and positioning. Morrison himself stood perfectly still, a slight smile on his face. "You have no idea what you've done, Sheriff. The things we've prevented, the threats we've stopped. Without us, this border will become a war zone." "Maybe," Navarro replied, keeping his weapon trained on Morrison while FBI agents moved in to make arrests. "But at least it'll be an honest war, not one orchestrated by people like you." As Morrison was cuffed and led away, he leaned close to Navarro. "This isn't over. The line has resources you can't imagine. Prison won't hold us, and when we get out, everyone involved in this will pay." The arrests at the Rocking K Ranch were just the beginning. Over the next 72 hours, synchronized raids across 4 states resulted in the detention of 43 individuals connected to the line. The operation made national news, though the full details were kept classified to protect ongoing investigations and prevent panic about the depth of corruption within border security agencies. Navarro found himself at the center of a massive federal investigation, spending long days in secure facilities providing testimony, reviewing evidence, and helping FBI agents understand the network of corruption he'd uncovered. Rosa Martinez was placed in legitimate witness protection after providing crucial testimony that corroborated the evidence from Mitchell's laptop. But Morrison had been right about one thing. The line had resources that ran deep. 3 weeks after the arrests, Navarro was driving home from another day of depositions when Teresa's voice crackled over his radio, urgent and frightened. Vicente, don't come to the station. Something's happening. Federal agents are here, but Foster says they're not real FBI. Before he could respond, his phone rang. It was Foster. They're making their move. Morrison made bail yesterday. Some judge we didn't even know was connected to them. They're issuing federal warrants for you, me, and everyone involved in the investigation. They're claiming we fabricated evidence, that we're the corrupt ones. Navarro pulled over, his mind racing. How is that possible? They have people everywhere, Vicente. Higher up than we realized. The Attorney General's office, federal judiciary, even congressional oversight committees. They're framing this as a rogue FBI operation that violated civil rights and manufactured evidence to advance careers. Where are you now? Mobile. They raided my hotel room 10 minutes ago. I grabbed what I could and ran. Vicente, they're going to kill us and make it look legitimate. Either we'll be shot resisting arrest, or we'll have accidents in custody. Navarro thought quickly. The old Coronado mine, 30 miles southwest of town. It's been abandoned since the 80s. Meet me there. That's in the middle of nowhere. Exactly. And I know those tunnels. My father worked that mine before it closed. As he drove toward the mine, Navarro called Teresa on a burner phone he kept for emergencies. Can you get out safely? I think so. They're focused on your office, going through files. Vicente, they have a federal warrant with your name on it. Murder, conspiracy, evidence tampering. They're saying you killed Mitchell and those others to cover up your own smuggling operation. Get to your sister's house in Phoenix. Stay off the grid. Don't use credit cards or anything traceable. What are you going to do? What I have to do, end this. The Coronado mine sat in a valley between two mountain ranges, its entrance partially collapsed but still accessible to those who knew the safe path through the rubble. Navarro arrived first, hiding his vehicle behind an old equipment shed and gathering supplies, water, flashlights, the weapons he always kept in his trunk, and most importantly, a satellite phone that couldn't be traced to him. Foster arrived an hour later, looking exhausted and frightened but determined. I brought everything I could grab from the investigation. Copies of files, recordings, Mitchell's original laptop. If we're going down, this evidence needs to survive. We're not going down, Navarro said with more confidence than he felt. Morrison made a mistake. He's so used to operating in shadows that he's forgotten what happens when you shine light on corruption. What do you mean? He thinks he can control the narrative because he has people in traditional media and government, but he can't control everything. Navarro pulled out the satellite phone and dialed a number from memory. It belonged to Maria Santos, an independent journalist who had been investigating border corruption for years. She answered on the third ring. Maria, it's Vicente Navarro. I have a story for you. The biggest of your career. But I need you to move fast and be very careful. Over the next 2 hours, Navarro and Foster transmitted everything to Santos. Documents, recordings, photographs, testimonies. The journalist had connections with WikiLeaks and several international news organizations that operated beyond the reach of U.S. government pressure. This is incredible, Santos said over the phone. But they'll destroy you for releasing this. They're going to destroy us anyway, Navarro replied. At least this way, the truth survives. While they waited for Santos to begin publishing, they prepared for the inevitable response. The mine provided good defensive positions, with multiple exits through old ventilation shafts if they needed to escape. But both knew they were simply buying time. The first story broke online at sunset. Massive corruption network discovered in U.S. border security. Within an hour, it was trending globally. Santos had been smart, releasing through multiple platforms simultaneously, making it impossible to suppress. Morrison's response came at midnight. Navarro heard them before he saw them. Vehicles approaching without headlights, the sound of helicopters in the distance. He and Foster had taken position deep in the mine, where the narrow tunnels would neutralize the advantage of numbers. "Sheriff Navarro, Agent Foster." Morrison's voice echoed through the mine entrance, amplified by a megaphone. "You're under arrest for treason, murder, and conspiracy. Come out peacefully, and you'll receive due process." "Due process like Mitchell got?" Navarro shouted back. "Mitchell was a traitor who endangered national security. You've done the same. But I'm offering you a chance he didn't get. Surrender, recant your false accusations, and you'll serve your time in minimum security. You might even survive your sentences." Foster whispered to Navarro. "He's stalling. They're probably sending teams through the other entrances." Navarro nodded. They had anticipated this, rigging noisemakers and primitive alarms at the alternate entrances. It wasn't much, but it would give them warning. "Morrison," Navarro called out. "The story's already out. The whole world knows about the line. It's over." "Stories can be discredited, Sheriff. We've already released evidence of your corruption, your connections to cartels. By tomorrow, you'll be the most wanted man in America. A corrupt sheriff who killed federal agents to protect his smuggling operation." A tin can filled with pebbles clattered somewhere deeper in the mine. One of their alarms. Foster pointed her weapon toward the sound, while Navarro kept watching the main entrance. "Here's what I don't understand, Morrison," Navarro said, buying time while trying to locate the intrusion. "You had everything. Power, resources, control. Why risk it all for what? Money? Money?" Morrison laughed. "This was never about money. It was about saving this country from itself. The official government is paralyzed by politics, by laws that protect criminals more than citizens. We did what needed to be done. You became the criminals you claimed to fight. We became what the situation required, and will continue, long after you're dead and forgotten." The attack came from 3 directions simultaneously. Smoke grenades rolled into the main tunnel, while teams breached the side entrances. Navarro and Foster fell back deeper into the mine, using their knowledge of the layout to stay ahead of their pursuers. The firefight was brief but intense. In the confined spaces of the mine tunnels, every shot was deafening, muzzle flashes blinding in the darkness. Navarro took a round in the shoulder. Foster was grazed across the ribs, but they managed to reach the old elevator shaft that served as their fallback position. "The ladder's gone," Foster said, looking down the shaft that dropped into deeper levels of the mine. "There's another way," Navarro gasped, pressing his hand against his bleeding shoulder. "Old ventilation tunnel. My father showed me when I was a kid." They could hear Morrison's men advancing, cautious now after losing 2 of their team to the defenders' ambush. The ventilation tunnel was barely wide enough for a person to crawl through, and it angled upward at a steep grade. With their injuries, it would be agony, but it was their only chance. As they climbed, Navarro could hear Morrison below, his voice carrying up the shaft. "Seal all exits. If they won't come out, they can die in there. We'll say they committed suicide rather than face justice." The tunnel seemed endless, and several times Navarro thought he would pass out from pain and blood loss, but Foster kept pushing him forward, and finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, they emerged on the mountainside above the mine. Below, they could see Morrison's men surrounding the mine entrances, setting up equipment to seal them permanently. But they also saw something else. News vans arriving on the access road, helicopters with media markings circling overhead. "Santos did it," Foster breathed. "She got the media here." Morrison couldn't kill them now, not with dozens of cameras recording everything, but he could still control the narrative if they were arrested. They needed one more piece of leverage. Navarro pulled out the satellite phone with his good arm and dialed a number Rosa Martinez had given him, one she said Mitchell had told her to use only in absolute emergency. The voice that answered was elderly but sharp. "Yes? This is Sheriff Vicente Navarro. Mitchell gave this number to Rosa Martinez. He said you could help if the line tried to bury the truth." There was a pause. "Is James really dead?" "Yes, sir. Murdered by Harold Morrison and his network." "I see. Sheriff, my name is Senator William Crawford, chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee. James was my grandson. I've been waiting for this call for 3 years, hoping he was still alive but preparing for the worst. Are you somewhere safe?" "For the moment. But Morrison has federal warrants claiming we're the corrupt ones." "Not for long. I'm calling an emergency session of the committee. Morrison and his associates are about to learn what real federal authority looks like. Can you hold out for 2 more hours?" "We'll try." Crawford was as good as his word. Within an hour, legitimate federal marshals arrived, along with members of the military police. Morrison and his men were arrested on charges of impersonating federal agents, murder, and treason. The warrants against Navarro and Foster were vacated. The cleanup took months. The investigation revealed that the line had operated for nearly a decade, responsible for dozens of deaths and millions of dollars in corrupt dealings. Some members fled the country. Others negotiated plea deals in exchange for testimony, and a few, like Morrison, chose to fight the charges in court. Morrison's trial became a sensation, with daily revelations about the depth of corruption within border security agencies. He maintained until the end that he was a patriot who had done what was necessary to protect America. The jury disagreed, convicting him on all charges. He received life without parole. Rosa Martinez testified via video link from her secure location, her courage in the face of threats inspiring others to come forward. Julie Smith, who had survived her captivity, provided crucial technical testimony about the evidence. Even the mysterious men in black who had appeared at the original crime scene were revealed to be members of a Mexican Special Forces unit that had been tracking the line's activities south of the border.